But if they are, if you want them to be able to. That makes sense. I believe there should be. Yeah. Yeah, in a webinar, there's no way to have it. Just yeah. No, it really does.
Do I want to trade? I guarantee you. Oh, wow. The risk assessment, you know. If you don't believe, have Andre kind of parse that one for you. What's the most optimal this year?
Yeah, I
Yeah, and then all kind of got sidetracked here and distracted, I guess.
You don't have names with her for your work.
Yeah, I mean, she's my mom.
Yeah.
So. Normally.
Our data center is under ours. Is it under ours? The data center or under the building?
I didn't
No,
even
but you
realize
need
that
it,
because I know there's the computing center. They were
Yeah.
super-
Yeah.
And I know there was one, but then she said, I don't know. I was like, he said, I don't know.
I've been in that building so many times.
Yeah. I don't know where you
I don't know
even
where
have
it
the room. Oh, so it is.
I didn't even
under
know we
our-
had a basement.
And maybe intentionally so. Nobody knows it's there. You can't break it.
So yeah, we are. Seems pretty cool. Up and pause, and recording up and pause. And Lillian just joined. So I'm just gonna redo the settings of our webinar when we're done today. Popo.
Yes, sir.
That laptop I thought. Placeholder.
Oh. It was, and I signed up for it, and then, my world, everything fell apart. So, I'm actually, it's on my list. I was gonna become a certified trainer.
Oh, that's nice.
Oh, you guys did too. He's been advising us, we did a complete rewrite of our bylaws. So I was gonna. Right. He comes in and brings our board anyway, has been on the new law. So they had all, literally just in that earlier general counsel. Yeah, I was just gonna. No, I gotta catch up training.
No.
We would be. Super helpful. I feel like he's halfway there. That's what he's done. Now that I have 2 minutes, I was kind of curious, because I thought it would give me insight as to how you're gonna, what kind of. Former political person. I wanted to get a sense. But it's just a time commitment. Like, are you
Oh, thank you.
Hey, Steve.
No. Other thing has
Yeah.
we're about to have our pretty massive public records class. And they were like, yeah, I was like, well,
No, I think that'd be sweet. Yeah. No, I think that'd be all things. Yeah.
Former president, first candidate, second. Now, OHSU is, I think, a clear example.
How long has she been taking piano?
Hold on to that. One in.
This
But,
is probably
it's gonna-
her.
Yeah,
She's in. Yeah, her 4th year. Loving it or? Yeah, and so she switched schools this year. And teachers are nice enough, like, I'll
Yes.
I'm like,
Oh my God.
because I was trying to keep as much at a limit, like connection with her. Yeah.
We're going to start in 2 minutes. 2 minutes. I don't think anybody heard me. You think they did,
No,
Si? I don't
no.
think anybody heard me.
Maybe we'll get the memo eventually.
Hey, give it up for our president.
So yeah.
And she switched schools if you had moved or just like,
Well,
Oh,
they did
all right.
tuition, and the
Oh,
way they
perfect.
rolled it out just didn't
So-
sit well with me.
Yeah,
because
yeah.
It was like 2 weeks before we had to sign contracts for the next year. You're gonna go up 12%. Not saying really anything
See
about
if
it.
I
They
can
just
get
kinda
rid of this
roll it out
stuff.
and we just kind of do this report and.
Good.
Yeah.
And so she went to another school, which has been great. She still goes to that school, but she takes
Nice.
swimming.
Now, some things are still connected, but they're both private. And what, not the public school, or it's just that? What was that one? Yeah.
If I didn't
David,
find out, I would-
Ruby,
but
Amy,
You have a mess
Renee,
right
do you
there at your
want
desk.
any of these?
I don't eat those.
These are organic.
I don't eat
Not
those.
really?
Want any?
I wouldn't mind a
If they were
couple.
Oh,
caramel,
like that.
if they were the caramel ones, then yes.
Oh, I need more sugar.
Thanks.
Yep.
They're a little shaky, but I was
Thanks,
to
Dakota.
not say anything.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm good out.
Welcome, Carl.
You hear that?
Which is your?
Good luck.
better?
You know, my husband.
Look out.
We are going to spend the next almost 2 hours talking about finances for the university in some shape or form. We have 5 different sections, and we will have a break just before 3 o'clock for about 10 minutes. And then we'll resume at 3 o'clock with really interesting information on Oregon's visibility and perception that will be passing with Ken Goldstein. So, but for now, we are going to start with Jamie, Brian, and Jeff. Welcome. Good to have you here. And I will, Jamie, give you a time check, but we've got about 45 minutes slotted for this section.
Right, I was gonna say, I know you're all excited to spend the next 2 hours talking about finances. Try to make this intriguing. We're gonna start off with the normal quarterly reports, and just before I pass it off to Brian to go to the details, I will say, sometimes I start off by telling you, oh, this is boring, this report is just like last time. That is unfortunately not the case. So when we look at our quarterly finance report that looks very specifically on what's happening with our education and general fund, the overall situation is getting worse. And so I'll just note a highlight, which is last spring, we thought that this was going to be a fantastic year where we were going to see actually more revenue than expenses. And what we were really worried about was the future, because we could see that expenses were growing faster than revenue was growing. Unfortunately, a combination of us not hitting the targets we were hoping to hit on the non-resident tuition side and then compensation costs coming up have actually flipped that story a little bit. And what we're seeing right now is a situation where expenses are actually slightly larger than revenue for this year before we even get into the future. And so I do want to highlight, Brian will run you through all the numbers. We are in unfortunately a different situation. And it was one number, I think last spring, we thought we were going to drop something like 15 million to the bottom line. By the fall, we thought that number was down to just under 8 million. And now we are at -2 and change. So we are seeing a trend that we're hoping is stopping at this point. But I do want to highlight that things have changed from the last time we met, unfortunately. So Brian.
All right. Well, as usual, we'll begin with our E&G key takeaways, our financial forecast for the end of fiscal 25. And then we'll move on to our quarterly metric and focus, which we do every quarter. For this quarter, we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about state funding, putting that in a national context in Oregon, and then driving that down in comparison to our AAU peers, and then with our sister institutions, sister public institutions in the state of Oregon. And feel free, as always, to stop me if you have any questions in process. We'll spend a little bit of time here on the key takeaways, and then in more detail in the next on the next slide where we have the numbers in front of us. State appropriations came up based compared to our initial forecast as the Higher Education Coordinating Commission did its final settle up. Those numbers, every year we do a process in late summer, early fall, where we submit our fiscal year 25 or fiscal year 24, the previous year's student credit hours and degree completion process. So we saw a positive settle up this year for the Student Success and Completion Model, as well as the ETSF, or Engineering Technology Sustaining Fund, where we receive funding for some of our physics and other technology-related programs. Tuition and fees, as Jamie just mentioned, revenue is down $10 million from the initial projection. If you remember back to our June board meeting last year when we set the expense authority, we also come forward with revenue projections. We had a discussion with this group in the fall about those numbers as we were seeing an adverse mix. So fewer non-resident students, which have a higher tuition load, but we have seen significantly more resident students, which is great on a mission basis, but does not have quite as much revenue attached to it. That number is up a little bit from our discussion at the September board meeting. As our provost mentioned earlier, we are seeing higher credit loads, both for incoming students and continuing students, which is a wonderful thing. It means our students are likely to be progressing through their education.
The question on that, because Chris talked about getting it to 15 credit hours. How much more could that possibly change over the next 3 years? Meaning the average goes, I don't know where it is. If it's 13 and it goes to 15, how much money does that mean?
Well, you can answer the money question, but I can tell you that we are, the numbers I was reporting this morning was for the incoming freshmen. And so I think we had what, 53%, we were up from 53 to 60% in terms of carrying that load. I'd like to see that 60% continue to increase as we go forward. So, you know, so there's some room for growth for that.
Could we see that number at 75? Trying to get a sense of, it's a $3.8 million delta versus our long-term projection, which is pretty significant. And now we have an effort to have freshmen recognize the meaning of having 15 hours. Could that end up being a $7 million delta versus?
So I would caution the straight assumption about increases. And the reason why I say that is I think when it comes to tuition loads or carrying loads, what we've seen in the past is it's a timing issue. So often you'll have people take higher loads. We'll see higher levels of revenue in the early years, but then sometimes that means, and this is wonderful academically, they're graduating earlier, which is fantastic. But then when you get to the end of that cycle, we actually can see revenue drop because normally we would have seen folks in their 5th year still coming. So there's there's an overall question of how many credits people take, but there's also a timing question of when those credits hit. A number of years ago, when we saw the initial push to get students to take more credits, we did see the higher carrying loads and we saw the revenue come in. And then we had not fully accounted for that in our modeling when we moved forward, and we saw a drop in revenue that we were not fully expecting. And that was that impact.
Mhm.
Like for, the incoming class, but also just overall.
Yeah, that's definitely a part of the dashboard we want to build out. I think I'd be remiss if I didn't also remind, us that it in some cases, it's not the best decision for a student to have that kind of load. So we want to be student oriented, but we want to get that increase, we want to get that up, that 15 credit load carrying load up.
Right. Personnel service or compensation are increasing as well. We've seen increased hiring in both our tenure track and non-tenure track faculty this year beyond our initial projections, as well as some funding shifts as more faculty come back off of sabbaticals. We had a little bit of a bolus work its way through post-pandemic. And we've seen some changes in grant funding in one particular college. So we're not totally sure if that's a timing component or if that's actual changes in underlying activity, as well as various changes in the OA compensation package. and lower vacancy rates really spread across the institution. Again, some things that we're working to understand whether those are one-time impacts or if that will continue over the longer term.
When you say increased hiring, were those above? I assume there's a process to determine whether you can actually hire and whether that person's been budgeted. Is it just the positions were filled sooner and we had fewer vacancies, or are people hiring above what was approved in the budget? That makes sense?
Yeah, so, and Amy, please weigh in at any time. Sort of depends on the different employee class. So our tenure track faculty, there is a pretty sort of strict or a long-term process in the institutional hiring plan led out of the provost's office. So that there are clear numbers about the amount of searches that are authorized. We make assumptions every year as to how many tenure track faculty are likely to leave the institution, and so there's a little bit of variability depending on retirements or other exits. For other employee classes, it's really a unit by unit. So we authorize a budget spend. Folks assume different vacancy rates. What we have seen is a little bit lower turnover than otherwise anticipated. I know as we're doing budget check-ins with units, we're just asking the question, how many vacancies do you have? We're hearing a lot of zeros, which is not typical, and certainly not typical over the past few years. So it depends. We do not have a position control roster where we say you have X amount of positions. We authorize budget centrally at the vice presidential level, and then expect at the vice presidential level, folks stay within their total budget authority. They do have fund balance out in the units that they could dip into on a one-time basis, but those are one-time funds, and so we do expect folks to come into line total budget. Student aid, our student aid forecast is down a little bit. Just to note, this is not our remissions budget. There are some dollars specifically in units for student aid. Sometimes that's used as a part of a remission program, particular to the unit and at the graduate level generally. So there are a couple of graduate programs that have a lower enrollment than otherwise anticipated. So that number has come down slightly. It's not a big number in the overall scheme, though it is on a percentage basis. Change. On net, our quarter one projection shows an estimated shortfall of $2.3 million. This compares to an initial gain of $15.1 million back in June, so about 6-7 months ago. As we discussed in fall, that came down to $7.8 million. Really what we have seen since that time is a minor increase in enrollment revenue or tuition revenue, and a pretty significant increase in compensation expense across the institution. Our projected year-end fund balance for fiscal year 25 at the end of quarter one is $114 million, or 8.6 weeks of operating expenses.
Can I ask one other? Assuming we reach a successful negotiation, will there be back? So when does the contract expire, and will that mean that, you know, if we were running 100 million, we raise, you know, I'm just going to use it, you know, we raise it and we have to, over the year, it's an extra $1 million. Will there be back pay increase that will have to happen? And so this number could actually be in Q1 if we actually allocated it on an accrual basis, we'd see that number being worse.
So our salary increases historically for faculty have been in January.
Okay.
And so what we've seen right now is the cost of the annualization of that in the fall. As we move forward with negotiations, you know, it depends what gets negotiated at the table in terms of the structure. But I will tell you that the numbers you're seeing now are based more on last year's increase in historical increases. And so additional things that are agreed to would obviously not, or I shouldn't say obviously, are not yet in these numbers. So that
Right,
could
so-
increase these numbers depending on what's agreed to at the table.
So the $2.3 million loss for the year, if we settle and the raise happens on January 1, this number could go
It would go up to the end. Yeah, if
We
we
would have
ended
a
up
greater
increasing
loss than
offers,
2.3
then
million.
that number would be higher for the time period that the increase would be in effect from most likely January to June. Not this fiscal year.
Thank you.
I'm gonna move through quickly. We've actually talked about most of the things that are on this slide. It's just really the same information in numeric form. I do want to orient folks to it so that as you're spending time looking through your packet, or if you have specific questions, on the left-hand side, each of the revenue and then expense categories in that order. First line, state appropriations, as noted, this increased over the year by $1.1 million. That $105.5 million or $105.6 million in pink on the far right-hand side, that is unlikely to change at this point. We have a very clear understanding of what our state appropriations are likely to be. Tuition and fees, as noted, decreased by $10 million. Again, this is early, it's quarter one. There is still some variability in those credit loads. We've seen in past year where, in fact, last year we had the opposite occur where we had lower than anticipated credit loads, and then those came up in winter and spring term. So we're a little conservative in our forecast this year, so there may be changes for winter and spring term this year. Total revenues down $8 million. And then on the expense side, the big piece to understand is that our total personnel, total compensation expense forecast up $11 million as of quarter one. As noted, there's variability in this number as we still have outstanding bargaining in process. And I'm just going to skip down total general expenses. This is our supplies and services and others. It's very early in the year, so we have not made significant changes to our forecast. As we have more information headed into second quarter, there may be some movement there. Total expenses up $9.5 million, and net before capital expenditures $2.7 million to the positive. We anticipate $5 million worth of capital expenditures coming from the general fund. These tend to be smaller projects initiated by the individual departments, not the large capital projects that you heard earlier today. Net after capital projects is a loss of $2.3 million on the year, and again, a fund balance of $114 million, or 8.6 weeks of operating expenses. I'll pause there if there are other questions on the quarterly financials, and if not, we'll move to the metric. So last year at about
one question, sorry.
Yeah.
I'm curious, it shows that like our end balance is 189 or 89% higher than forecast. Temporary or why that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think you're referring to the quarterly. So we have a highly cyclical our revenue and a less cyclical expense structure. So we have three major inflows of resources along with the terms. And so as students and their families pay for tuition at fall term, winter, and spring term, those are major inflows of cash. Our expenses are pretty ratable through the year, as most, though not all of our employees are paid on a 12-month basis, including many of our 9-month employees. So we tend to build cash balances and build fund balance early in the year, and then it titrates down to a low point in midsummer.
It's just timing.
Just timing. Sorry.
It occurs to me in looking at this that we have this kind of a structural problem. I know at the risk of stating the obvious that as I tried to look back in time, it looks that our expenses are growing at about 5% a year with what's baked in with personnel cost and PERS and benefits and utilities, and our revenue grows at 3.5, maybe 4, masked somewhat by growth and enrollment over the last few years. And we seem to get into the details, but never really step back and go, how much farther can we push that model of 5% expense growth and 3% revenue growth? And so to me, it feels at some point we've got to step back and have kind of a high level discussion of we've got to change the model, either revenue or expenses, or we're kind of a train going at a wall. And at some point we're going to hit it. So, and as we get buried in the details, sometimes it feels like we don't come up to that level. So I'm not sure where we build that into our discussion, but would like that to be.
Thank you for stating that, Andy. That's exactly our problem. And we have hidden it with enrollment, and maybe we're hitting that wall. And that is going to be a conversation that needs to happen. I know it happens in Johnson Hall, and it's going to have to be a conversation here as well. So.
Especially with it happening
a bit quicker than what you had predicted, Jamie, the last meeting in terms of kind of the worst case scenario that now we're I don't know, maybe it's like climate change where it starts speeding up.
Yep.
The
Yeah,
closer you get.
I absolutely think it's a good conversation to have. I mean, it goes back to the structure of our budget where almost 80% of our budget's invested in people and those costs are going up at a high rate. And more than 80% of our budget, or not more, 78, 79% of our budget comes from tuition, which we're trying to keep those rate increases low for students. And when you have a big difference between what your compensation costs are going up and your tuition costs are going up, unless there's more enrollment or you're cutting costs in other places, you're going to run into some real challenges. And I would add to it that it doesn't help us that the state mandated healthcare program and the state mandated retirement program are growing even faster in terms of their cost increases, and those are mandatory programs. So it puts us in a very, very challenging place. I think the jury's still out. We'll hear from that enrollment management team tomorrow, I think, about what's going on there. It's still a little early to know what that looks like, but in terms of the added enrollment, but it's a very tough structural situation we're in.
I wonder if this is a good topic for the finance committee to do rather than, I think it's hard to do in a setting like this, but maybe a smaller group can spend some time.
Great suggestion. We will do that between now and our March meeting. Yep. Thanks.
I'm going to shift gears a little bit to another revenue item unlikely to grow at as fast as some of our costs. Our state funding, we brought this to the board last year about this time and focused a little bit more on the distribution model that the Higher Education Coordination Commission uses. This time we're going to spend a little time on state funding, but put it in a national context, both compared to other states, comparing our institution to other AAUs, and then spending a little bit of time comparing the amount of revenue or amount of state general fund that's distributed to our institution in that comparison to other institutions. Oregon. This is a slide I suspect that the board has seen before. If you have not, we will be bringing it many a time. This is the public higher education appropriation, so state funding on a per student basis, including both resident and non-resident students. The orange bar in the middle is the United States average. So if you take all the states in the District of Columbia, find the weighted average, it's about $10,000 per student. Oregon on the far left-hand side, I think it's the 44th in the country. So the 6th lowest, said alternatively, and it's about $6,400 on a per student basis. So we receive about 63% of the average, or Oregon, excuse me, invests about 63% of the average state appropriations. So we are, to put it bluntly, a low state appropriation state. That is particularly true for the four-year public institutions. This data is just the universities, not the community colleges. An important thing to note, if you look through the states, our West Coast partners, Washington and California, both to the right-hand side of the U.S. average. So both of those states, the north and the south of us, are both higher state appropriation states. Yes.
I really, sorry, I appreciate seeing this in our packet often, but I feel like I need more information about how we compare in terms of FTE per university. Like, are we a higher FTE university, an average size FTE amount? Because it's by FTE, so I just need to know how we're comparing.
Yeah. So maybe a couple of thoughts on that real quickly, and then if we move to the institutional comparisons, that may be a helpful one. So I think the way to think about student FTE for public institutions is, are we a higher importer of students? So does Oregon have a larger proportion of non-resident students or a lower proportion? To that, I don't have a clear answer. I know that when you look to the University of Oregon and Oregon State, who both have pretty large non-resident populations, and the University of Oregon was kind of early to that game compared to some other public institutions. So maybe higher for a few of us institutionally, maybe lower when you look at some of the other institutions. So that's hard to tell. Some states fund non-resident students, view that as an investment in their economy and the long-term success of their state and growing educated talent base. Some states don't, like Oregon. So we'll talk about that.
And I also like and this is probably not something for y'all to do, but like as I look at this chart, I think about our own funding sources as a state, and they're not as diversified as some other states, and so it's hard to then know what what the burden is, if you will, on our state compared to say like Mexico or Illinois. I have no idea. It's just hard to sort of really compare.
Yeah, we did some looking at this a few years ago. I don't have the information off the top of my head and like total tax revenues on a per sort of state GDP basis. I'll see if we can dig that up and follow up.
Yeah, I was also wondering about just our efficiency comparisons within this universe in terms of our employee headcount, other kinds of best practices, evals that we look at when we're trying to look at our cost load relative to what our deliverables are and how we're serving that end goal of the education cost per student.
So we don't have that data when you compare state to state. And just to be clear, this is not U of O, this is the state of Oregon in terms of their PUSF funding.
Yeah.
We do have that data though when you compare the University of Oregon to the other public AU institutions. And we traditionally have had much lower staffing levels per student, whether it's on the teaching faculty side or the administrative staff side. And we can get you those numbers. Traditionally, we share those in March when we do the tuition recommendations. I can also share the thing that to me makes this chart really challenging is there's really another chart we probably should have put up here that we didn't, which is our state provides the lowest pot of funds on a per student basis to the four-year universities. And when you look at the costs of our state mandated benefits, they're some of the highest in the country. And so you have this double whammy from a state perspective in that you're getting really low state appropriation per student, but you're required to have your employees participate in very, very expensive benefit programs, which then makes the cost of any single employee much, much higher because of that. And so when you combine those two together, it puts us in a very, very challenging position. I want to say, Brian, I think as a state, I think we were in the top 6 or 7 in terms of cost of benefits programs in the country, is my memory. Again, looking state to state.
Oh, I'm sorry to just one more thing. I think that those 2 points that we just talked about are important for the community to appreciate and understand, because so often the narrative is, well, we have too many headcount from an administrative standpoint or what have you. And then the benefit package is not included in the overall compensation in the minds of people because they're just looking at, say, salary. So not the load. And because we are very generous on the benefit side as mandated, but still it's part of the package. So anyway, I think to the extent we can be socializing some of those a little bit more broadly at the opportune times, it's helpful because we're a small university and we do look pretty good when you look at all of that combined.
Can I ask one more
Bonnie?
question real
Yep.
quick? I would, to piggyback on Toya's question, I would be curious to know what states have dedicated revenues for higher education.
Like a funding stream. Remark.
This data, I'm glad we share it. I want to warn us from feeling woe is us. I came here in 1985 to work for the University of Oregon. It was exactly the same. Everybody talked about there's no money. State of Oregon doesn't provide any money. 1985. It's never changed. We aren't in our situation today because of this. We've lived with this forever. It does drive our costs higher because of the benefits. That accelerates faster maybe than other places. But this has been our world for 40 years that I know of.
I mean, just piggyback on what Andy brought up, I'm just curious when you look at the high funding, what is the secret sauce? Is it that if we are facing kind of systemic challenges to the business model, what is out there? And in states where they're making investment, what does that look like?
Mexico, Wyoming,
Probably.
So let's keep, any question is really good to ask, and we'd rather take time from Brian because of questions than me just saying, Brian, you're done. So don't be afraid to ask any question. That's good. You have 15 minutes.
Thank you, sir. So I'm gonna switch paces a little bit and now take state appropriations on a per student basis, but only among our AAU peers. The center line here is the average across all of the public institutions at $10,700, pretty similar to what you saw previously across 50 states on an average basis. The University of Oregon receives $3,900. This is fiscal 22 data, the most recent that's available. So the University of Oregon does not receive funding at the average amount of other institutions in Oregon. We'll see that on the subsequent slides. And on a per student basis, and this is including both resident and non-resident FTE, we're receiving significantly less than our AAU peers. We are down at the bottom with our perennial friends, University of Colorado Boulder. But again, this is an important note. UVO receives about a third or a little over a third of the average funding on a per student basis from state appropriations as our AAU peers who we're competing with. We look very, very different in terms of our funding streams. So that impacts us because it does mean that we are much more reliant on market-based revenue, for which there is significant competition. So that has a very different exposure for the institution and the way that we have to work to gain our revenues. So we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about our state funding. We have seen this information a year ago, so I'll just spend a moment to provide some descriptions of the way the state funding model works. The legislature appropriates the Public University Support Fund to the HEC. The HEC then has the responsibility to distribute those funds out to the 7 institutions, which it does by a funding model that the HEC has adopted and put into Oregon administrative rules called the Student Success and Completion Model. The Student Success and Completion Model has 3 basic components to it. We could spend an hour on this if we wanted to go into the detail. One of those components, the activity-based funding, is student credit hours. To borrow the phrase of one of our deans this morning, it's kind of butts and seats. So however many students we have, fundable students, which I'll define in a moment, and however many credit hours they're taking. Second component, which is by far the largest, is outcomes-based funding. And that depends on how many degrees or certificates at the master's or at the undergraduate, master's, and PhD level are conferred again to fundable students. And then mission differentiation funding, which is some combination of either flat and across the board to each of the 7 institutions, or actually grows the smaller an institution is to help support some of the smaller institutions that don't have haven't reached a scale or a size at which they have some economies of scale. Fundable students are Oregon resident students at the undergraduate and master's levels, as well as all PhD students. So the state it's the one place where they fund non-resident students at the doctoral level.
Online or treated differently?
Online are treated exactly the same.
Outcomes-based funding, if I'm understanding you correctly, is a function of student credit hours.
Yes.
So if you have more students, you're getting the benefit.
The degrees are a function of both how many students you have and how efficient you are at getting them through to completion. And so as our president has focused on in the strategic plan to increase our 4-year and 6-year completion rates, that should drive up the number of degree completion. They're not a 1-to-1 ratio of in and out.
There are factors, and I don't think you've mentioned this, that give different amounts of money for different types of students. And so one of the places that the model does not help us is there are some degrees like engineering that OSU has a lot of that the model pays a lot of money through for. And so there's some, it's a much longer conversation that we definitely don't have time for today, but there are some challenges. You'll see we get the lowest funding per student of all the campuses, and there's some kind of challenges in terms of how the model's structured.
Yeah, I will go very quick on these last slides. There are also 4 direct legislative funding streams, state programs that are for really non-educational, generally non-educational programs, or for other public services. The statewide public services that go exclusively to Oregon State University as part of its land grant mission. Sports lottery funding that augment both athletics and graduate scholarships. And then this last biennium, there was some supplemental funding provided to the technical and regional universities, as well as Portland State, who have seen some significant declines of enrollment to help them kind of tide that through as they adjust their operating structure. Here, big wall number. I won't go through all of them. The total public university support funding, as you might anticipate, varies pretty significantly, with the smaller institutions receiving less in an aggregate form. And then the three larger institutions, OSU, PSU, and U of O, receiving more. See, we are on the right-hand column at $92.4 million. This is fiscal 24. You want to spend a little bit of time talking about the total state funding, where we take both the public university support funding and then all those different funding streams, which the vast majority of which flow into the education in general fund and are non-trivial. So you see in particular our partner up the road at Oregon State receives a significant amount, particularly for the statewide public services. University of Oregon total funding about $97 million. When we switch to the next slide, we're going to put that on a per fundable student basis so we can really start comparing those.
On a statewide public service, is that?
So there are there's a couple components. One is the extension services, where there are sites across the state, agricultural experiment station, and the forest research lab. Importantly, those fund a whole lot of faculty and the research component of the faculty expenditure, which offsets some costs that otherwise are being funded by public university support fund or tuition dollars. Fundable students at the top, just highlight basic numbers. U of O, second largest at 12,700. PSU is slightly smaller, and then Oregon State is slightly bigger at just shy of 18,000 students. Putting the PUSF on a per student basis, the University of Oregon has about $7,200, or significantly lower than any of the other institutions just from the Public University Support Fund. Once you stack in all of the state funding, including the statewide public services, et cetera, you see the U of O's funding increases a little bit on a per student basis to $7,500, though many of the other institutions increase significantly, and particularly Oregon State at $16,800. Pretty significant difference, particularly when you spread that over 12,000 residents.
When was the last time this was different?
Well, it changes every year to small.
No, I
degrees.
mean different. I mean, when was the last time we were ahead of Oregon State or we were ahead of Portland State? When was the last time it materially was different?
PSU has higher funding today than it did 2 or 3 years ago through the last adjustment in the model, which put more dollars towards transfer students. And Portland State University has a significant amount of transfer students coming out of its partner community.
Was that a
college.
change to the model or was that lobbying by Portland State?
It was that's a hard question to answer. It was a change to the model, which is the prerogative of the Higher Education Coordinating Commission, which was negotiated with the 7 institutions.
I would say in general, having tracked this for a number of years, we've always been at the bottom. It's just the way it's been. Portland State used to be with us at the bottom, and the change that Brian's referencing, which particularly incents transfers from community colleges, really changed their per student numbers. Now they have their own issues they're dealing with enrollment that are causing some significant budget issues up there, but we are now alone, I would say, at the bottom, and when we used to be there with them.
I mean, the other longer run change, everybody recognized that this does not include anything for our out-of-state students. And our proportion of out-of-state students, I assume, I'm looking at Brian and Jamie, has slowly edged up. And so if, you know, Steve's halcyon days of 20 years ago, when things were still the same, I bet we, you know, our number of in-state students was closer to, 70% or 80%. Now it's closer to 50%, and there is zero funding for our out-of-state students.
What is that?
$6,200. How much of that is achievable through some of our initiatives here? Graduation rates, load, etc.
On a per student basis, it will not impact that demonstrably. We would expect that our overall funding would increase as we drove up enrollment. Their program mix is one that will likely always have them at a higher per student funding.
And what is the rationale?
Our metrics are already better, not hugely so, than Oregon State's graduation rates, retention.
There's one more slide, and I'll go over it very quickly. I actually won't spend a whole lot of time. The last piece of it is just an analysis of each of these institutions' education and general funds. At the bottom is the proportion made up of state funding. Ours is by far the lowest for the reasons that we have already discussed.
Oh, I'm sorry, is Eastern getting a supplemental because of a tough time, or is that standard?
So there are two pieces, Eastern, OIT, Southern, Western, as well as Portland State are all receiving supplemental funding this biennia, which will continue into next year because they're having a tough time. And as an ongoing basis, the four smaller institutions, so that less PSU, all receive additional funding because they are serving different regions of the state.
And it recognizes there are scale economies that work against them. So
So
it's,
when do we hit the number when we hit the tough time? Like what number do we have to get to?
yeah, well,
Get the tough time incentive.
yeah, that is an interesting question. I will share as we've been
GTI.
tracking our fund ENG fund balance that I don't know if it was 3, 4, 5 years ago, we actually had the lowest fund balance in terms of weeks of operating expense of any of the campuses. So we definitely have hit hard times. But no, we did not get any special funding related to that. So
Brian, how is I'm sorry, go ahead. Lisa.
Well, we have this conversation every year and nothing's changed since you were
Right.
20.
25.
take 20, Steve.
So I just wonder, and this might be something for our government people and at a higher level than where I am. But when do we start talking about issuing bonds for higher ed like we do for Portland Public Schools or somebody like that? Where we have to find another funding source because we're not going to get it out of the heck. Salem. I mean, I don't know. I kind of feel like it's like we were saying, we're having the same conversation over and over again, and we can only raise tuition so much. We can only lower faculty and employees so much. When do we and what can we do at a higher level to find another funding source that actually
It really dovetails into Andy's comment. It's really what it is. It's really saying, hey, it's not balancing. What's the solution? And one answer is saying to the state of Oregon, there needs to be more money. Would go to everybody. Hasn't happened in a long time, but we could argue that. And then the other one is just looking at how we run our business. And that's Andy's comment. Because those are really good points and things that we know all of Johnson Hall talks about it. So it's coming up to be a, important issue for all of us to hammer home on. What is net tuition revenue and why is PSU so much lower than ours if our enrollment's the same?
Yeah, net tuition revenue is list price tuition minus institutionally funded remissions. PSU has significantly fewer non-resident students than the University of Oregon does.
Yep. And that's really the answer then.
Yep. And I don't mean to cut off discussion, but I am aware that we have 5 more presentations in the next hour. So I'm
We
hoping.
we set aside 45 minutes for this part.
Oh,
So
okay.
you got
Do
a
you
couple
want?
minutes left. Yeah.
Okay. All right.
That doesn't mean you don't keep going.
Then we have 10 minutes set up for Jeff.
Okay.
Are there other questions, or I will hand it over to Jeff?
Thank you.
I didn't mean to cut off conversation. I just wanted to make sure you weren't going to give us the 2 minutes per presentation.
Nope, we got time for Jeff. We got 10 minutes set up for you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Yeah. That better?
While Jeff's figuring that out, I will just say I'm happy to share that I think both the quarterly and annual treasury report will be more of a consistent report from what you've seen in the past and fewer surprises in terms of where we are. So go for it, Jeff.
Thank you. Good afternoon. We'll start with the cash and investment balances graph. And as I'm sure as you've looked at this year, where it's very similar to what we've shown over the last several quarters. The primary factors contributing to that is also the same. The 2 primary ones being our investment income, which was $24 million greater in the first quarter of fiscal year 2025 than it was in the prior year. and also plant funds, which was $10 million higher than the same period last fiscal year. In total, we were about $48 million greater than same period last fiscal year. But if you recall when I reported this last quarter, that number was at 85 million. So we have substantially decreased in our year over year spread. And a lot of that is because of our plant fund balances, but I'll get into that in more detail in the next couple of slides. On this next slide is our cash investment balances again, but in a 5-year line graph. I'm actually going to jump right to the next slide because in this one we blow up the first quarter, so I think it's a little bit easier to see. You can see at the beginning of the quarter, we still had a pretty substantial gap. In fact, we were about $70 or $80 million year over year increase. However, as the quarter went on, that increase, gradually reduced down to the point that we were almost even with last year. There's really two reasons. One is because of the increased operating expenses that Jamie and Brian have been talking about. But the second is, as I mentioned, plant funds. And as an example, when I looked at plant fund average balances in July, it was $180 million. By the time we reached September, that was all the way down to $146 million. A pretty substantial decrease. That was mostly to fund the night campus and the heritage project and a number of other construction projects going on around campus. Now, I do want to note and let you know that in October, we did receive some pretty substantial transfers back into our plant funds. One for the night campus from the foundation. The other, we received quite a bit of reimbursement funds from the state of Oregon for different projects going on, particularly the heritage project. And that has kind of stabilized our year over year increase. If I had to forecast right now, I'd say we'll be in at about $60 million when I report to you next quarter. So as I said, this quarter was 48 million. Next quarter, it's going to be right around that, maybe a little bit better. And the final slide for the quarterly report, I like to show this to you at this time each year, because in July, we make our large payment to the state of Oregon for bonds that they issued on our behalf when we were part of the university system. As you can see here, our total debt service is at $823 million right now, as of September 30th, actually. And that is a $23 million decrease compared to the same period of time last year. So we have made some progress on our debt portfolio. And I will stop there for the quarterly update and see if there are any questions before I go on. You all? I will move right on to the annual update then. Again, there's a lot of slides here, and so I'm going to go through these quickly. If there are any questions as we go through these, please let me know. I'd be happy to answer them. The first slide, a lot of these are just a review of our fiscal year 2024. This is our investment return slide. You can see we did pretty well compared to our benchmarks. The one area I do want to point out is our T3 portfolio. As you can see, that's on the far right-hand side. We were almost 2 percentage points below our benchmark. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is the benchmark has a lot of public equity in it. In fact, 60% of the benchmark is public equity, which did very, very well over the last fiscal year. We don't have in our T3 portfolio, don't have that level of public equity exposure. We do, however, have a lot of private equity exposure. And what happens is the valuation of that private equity takes a while. It lags in, from the point in time until we get that valuation. There's a pretty significant lag. And so we feel that as time goes on, we'll actually pick up some percentage points on our return and look much better against the benchmark. When I look at this, I don't look at the 1-year return because of those lags. But when I look at the 3, 5, and 10-year returns for the T3 portfolio, you'll see that we beat the benchmark in all of those categories by about 1.5 percentage points. So if we look long term, it does look much better for that portfolio. Moving on to net investment income, you can see a 10 or 11-year bar graph here. And we had a very, very good year, as we've been talking about throughout this fiscal year. We brought in $35 million in net investment income. 28 million of that was realized income, with $8 million of that unrealized. As we talked about throughout the fiscal year, That's because of the high short-term rates. We have a lot of funds in our short-term investments. We were able to take advantage of that and bring in a lot of investment income. I think going forward with rates going down a little bit, we may not reach the same level, but hopefully this year yet will be pretty close to that. The next two slides, we go over some of the risk factors for the portfolio. This one is our credit risk. We feel very comfortable with where we're at. All of our checking accounts, which is on the far left-hand side, are fully collateralized. If any of the banks that we have accounts with go under, we will be fully reimbursed for that. We also have a large amount, as you can see, with the state treasury, with our Oregon short-term fund account. That is not only supported by the state of Oregon, but it's also a AA rated fund. And so, as you can see, we have nothing below BBB. We're very comfortable with our credit risk overall. Likewise, with our liquidity risk, because of the funds that we have in checking account and the Oregon short-term fund designated here by state treasury, that's about $500 million of our funds. We can get at all of these within 1 or 2 business days. So we're very confident in the liquidity of the portfolio.
We're getting a yield up on credit of our checking accounts.
We are, yes. We sweep that into an account. That earns us interest. The next slide, just give a little background on this. One of the main functions of the internal bank is to take the money in the bank, whether that's from bond issuance or repayment of loans, whatever money we have, we'd like to recycle that. That's how we call it, and send that back out as loans to the organization. But we also have cash outflows because it's through the internal bank that we make bond payments to our external bondholders. And that's what this represents here. On the left-hand side are repayments that we're getting for loans made out to units all over campus. And on the right-hand side, those are the debt service payments that we make to our bondholders. I think the main point to make here is that you can see over the next several years, we're bringing in more money than what we're paying out to our bondholders. Again, we like to recycle that, send that back out, and lend it back out to units throughout the university. But we do model this, and I want to assure you that as we model this, we're very confident that we'll be able to have enough cash available to make all the large bullet payments that you see beginning in 2045 to our external bondholders. Debt characteristics, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because we haven't issued debt since 2021. So everything's remained pretty much the same. We still have all fixed rate debt issuance. The only real changes, as we've talked about it a couple of quarters ago, is that we have received credit rating changes. Moody's actually reaffirmed our rating at AA2, but changed the outlook from stable to positive. And in June of 2024, so just this summer, S&P did a credit review. They reaffirmed our rating at AA minus and changed our outlook from stable to positive. So we've had some really good credit reviews. Moody's is actually coming in January to update their credit review. And so hopefully the next time we meet, I'll have an update for you on that. The next several slides are peer comparisons, which we give to you each year. Again, I'm going to go through these quickly. Let me know if you have any questions. Kind of the overriding theme here is that we have an improving balance sheet. Our cash investments are going up, as we've talked about. Our debt is going down a little bit. And so that is showing up as improved ratios. But despite that, you're going to see that as we compare ourselves to our peers, we still are on the very low end of our peer comparisons. And that's a general theme going through here. A little more background is that just to let you know, our peers in these set of series of graphs are AAU public institutions that do not belong to a system. So we want to make sure we pulled out just separate universities. You will notice in this one, it's a university-only slide. There are a number of institutions that show up as non-applicable, and that's because they don't pull out their foundation assets. So we didn't want to include them in this. Subsequent slides will show these schools with foundation assets. So this first one, cash and investments per student FTE. As you can see, not only are we with the 4th lowest of our peer group, but we are also only 47% of the median. Again, we showed slight improvement. If I recall correctly, I think last year when I reported on this, we were at about 38%. We are improving as far as the ratio goes, but we aren't improving as far as our position within the peer group. This is the same ratio here, but this time we include foundation assets. You can see with the assets and the balances that are held at the foundation, we do improve somewhat. We're very close to the median, closer to the middle of our peer group. But as we state here, and something very important to note, is that foundation assets are mostly restricted. And so those are assets that are not available for university general use. But it is nice to show us in comparison with other universities when we do include the foundation.
It also means that our foundation assets relative to students is higher than most in this peer group, which is actually kind of an interesting point. We do numerous generous donors. We have more than most.
That is very true. Yes. And the next slide is net assets per student FTE. Just quickly in simplistic form, net assets are our total assets less our total liabilities. So this does include capital assets or our buildings. It also includes any pension liabilities we have. And here you can see we're about in the middle of the group, but still significantly below the median at about 63% of the median. Again, a slight improvement. I believe last year we were at 58%, slight improvement there, maintaining our position within the peer group. Our next peer group comparison is cash and investments per operating expense. Once again, we are very low compared to our peer group, well below the median. But when we add in foundation assets, we jump all the way up to the third best. Really two reasons. One, as I mentioned, the foundation has significant assets, so that definitely improves our standing here. But the other thing to note is that even though, as Brian and Jamie have spoken about, with expenses rising, when we look at ourselves compared to our peer group, our operating expenses are actually still pretty low. And so that really causes this jump in our position within the peer group comparison. The final peer group slide that I have for you today is debt per operating revenue. And this is where we are at the highest, but this means is that we have more debt. That's not a good thing, correct? It means we have more debt compared to operating revenue than any of our peer group. If there's some good news in this, when I reported this last year, we were at 1.0 times. We dropped to 0.9 times. If I take this out 3 decimal points, we're actually at 0.854. And so we're very close to getting to that 0.8, which would be equal to, a number of other institutions here. When I look at this is all fiscal year 2023 data. That's the most recent we could get from Moody's. When I look at this ratio for fiscal year 2024, I'm fairly certain, even though Moody's does make some adjustments, that we aren't entirely sure of how those will shake out. I still believe that we'll be at 0.8 next year. So we are making improvements in this. Again, it's because our debt's going down, operating revenue is going up.
We know the rate of our debt payment rate, the interest rates that we're paying, how they compare with others.
Yeah, because we actually have very good rates. If
I know that.
Yeah. I don't know how we compare to others. I have not looked at that. I can certainly.
Is there, we could find that information?
I would have to talk to our underwriters, I think, to see if I can get something from them. But we'll look into that.
What's our next bond issue? Is it East Campus housing or what's, if you're looking out 2, 4 years?
Yeah, so when we look at that, it definitely will be East Campus housing and that next generation housing project. We don't see any projects that would need financing, external financing anyway, prior to that. I see that, and I would need to talk to Mike a little bit more when they think they're going to have shovels in the ground. But I see, because we do have some money in the internal bank, we can start that funding with and financing with. It'll probably be between 1 and 2 years that we'll do that next bond issue.
Try to wrap it up now, Jeff.
Last slide is external factors, and I think most of you are aware of what's happening with interest rates, so I'm not going to spend any time on that. I think the 2 biggest points here are the bottom 2 bullet points. Moody's and S&P came out with their higher ed sector ratings. Same as last year, Moody's is at stable, S&P is at bifurcated. Basically what they're saying is a large, well-known name brand universities are going to do better than the smaller institutions throughout the nation.
Time for one question. Anybody have one?
Take any questions?
Thank you, Jeff. The next section, we're going to talk about the thermal systems project. This is intentionally on here because there was a whole committee task force that looked at it. It was a broad task force of a lot of people. There were multiple suggestions or options. There was one suggestion made. We want it to be on our agenda to show we're not ignoring it, but we also know that there are some financial consequences to it. We wanted to address those today. And Jamie, thanks for putting together a presentation.
Terrific. Yeah, we're gonna do, I think Steve is joining us. Great. Steve and Brian, who led our task force. And mainly what we want to do today is give you an update on the work that we've done since the last time we updated you on this project. We did a deeper dive on the idea of electric boiler and really share with you, kind of just remind folks what that looks like, share with you what we learned from going through the schematic design process, what some of the operational costs, which is what we were getting a better handle on, would look like, and then just put that in the context of our financial situation and some potential funding models so that you can understand what the impact would be if we were to move forward with the project. So I'm gonna.
Just as a reminder, I am recusing myself from any discussion on this topic.
Yep, great, thank you. And so we're gonna tag team a little bit, and we'll try to keep it at a high level so there's time for questions. But feel free to jump in anytime, as always. Steve, I think you're up next.
Thanks, everybody. This is a slide you've seen before. The last time we presented to you in March. At that point in time, I think it was called option 2B, and we've cleaned it up a little bit because we've done an additional study on it. This basically says that what we are now moving forward with studying is this electrode boiler. You could, somebody who's pull it all up. There are pros and cons to installing this electrode boiler. We chose it as something to study because it's essentially non-disruptive, right? The campus community would largely not even know it happened, right? They wouldn't disrupt any classes or research or really anything like that. It has immediate emissions reduction. So those are some of the obvious reasons to move forward with it relative to the others. And the cons are that it is relatively expensive, as you can see, on a per unit of heat or emissions reduced saved.
I'm sorry, could you refresh us? When we're looking at the emissions reduction and moving to electric, we're on the grid, so there's a mixture of sources of the electricity being generated from hydro and other sources, including probably coal.
Sure. So the system that we're on now, to start there, is entirely natural gas based. If we were to electrify, to go with electric, we'd be working with the Eugene Water and Electric Board, EWEB's portfolio. I think it's about 75% is hydro. It might be 72, but somewhere right there. Another 10, 15%, give or take, are other renewables. And there is, as you say, some fossil fuels, largely natural gas, very, very little coal on that in that resource mix.
I think the question the way I understand it, Amy, is if we were to do this, does it reduce the carbon footprint for the region, or does it just shift to somebody else then have to go on to something because we just took more electric? Or does the amount of electricity increase and we grab that? Or does it just move somebody else over to the other? Does it improve the area, or do we just feel good about what we're doing?
That's a great question. The way I would answer it is that this stuff moves forward in fits and starts, right? So in the short term, it's possible it has the effect that you're talking about, right? But what we are trying to do here is work in tandem with the regional grid, and what we see the regional grid doing is decarbonizing, right? So over a longer horizon, 5 years, 7 years, 10, 25 years, we have every reason to expect significant decarbonization of the electric grid.
But if that happens, we would naturally then improve also, right? Because the whole grid would improve.
Right. So but I think to answer your question, if we were to electrify our heating sources, we do that with the assumption, but I think that, a reasonable assumption that the grid will improve to meet that electrification that we and so many others are contemplating.
Right.
But Steve, if the grid improves, we don't change it.
We don't change it, then we
Yeah.
wouldn't.
Then
And I'm sorry, and how do we factor in this 27 million to 32 million of the substation? Who is responsible for paying for that? Is that us?
That would be our cost to bear.
To be very clear, I know we're jumping around a little bit. In the numbers, I just want to make sure we're clear. In the numbers that Brian's going to walk you through, we did include the debt cost for the initial boiler installation. We did not include, because it doesn't go far enough out, that in 10 years, there would be another significant investment, which would be the substation piece. So just to be clear of what's in and what's out of the numbers that you're going to see Brian walk you through.
That's a real.
It has a question.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Now, and maybe you're getting to these numbers, but how does the cost, the additional cost of this choice impact the infrastructural cost of going with
At the very
the,
end
the
of that question.
infrastructural cost of disruption and all that? What are the comparators? If we were
So-
to go with another option.
And the other options were closer to, Steve, remind me, like hundreds of millions of dollars.
Okay.
And this boiler would have very little impact to campus users. I think other than a switchover day, nobody would probably notice.
This was the lowest cost option, and that was the recommendation that came. to
It was
us.
the lowest investment cost, but not the lowest operating cost, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no.
So the incremental cost of the electricity was higher, but some of these other options literally were hundreds of millions of dollars, which meant if we looked out 70 years, those might be better, but on a short-term basis, we wouldn't have been able to borrow the amount of money that the other options would have required. You have a question, then I have another question.
And Marcia was on the task force, just.
How much of this decision is driven by the fact we need to replace a boiler versus that we want to be more environmentally sustainable?
We have two gas boilers, and the next one is due for replacement, I think, in 2040. So we're not facing a deferred maintenance cost relative to those two gas boilers at this point.
Do we know, Steve, if any of the efforts by eWeb to become less carbon dependent are based on potential federal funding of, decarbonization efforts, which are likely on the cutting block with the new administration?
Actually, eWeb and other utilities, public utilities in particular, private as well, actually in Oregon and the Northwest are much more driven by state regulations than anything by the Fed.
I'm curious, I'm assuming we're using legacy technology just cheapest. I see that it's one technology, so.
Well, it's not why we're doing it, but the recommendation is sort of alluded to by others. This one is significantly cheaper on the capital side, right? The capital cost of the options, what we called 3 and 4 at the time, are north of 500 million, I think north of 600 million each. And once they're financed, they're north of $1 billion. And as you can see, this one is, an order of magnitude less.
I had just another quick question. With the amount of innovation due to our shortage of electricity relative to the demand coming from AI, it seems like there will be some relatively soon options beyond what we're talking about here for powering a community such as a university, because of these data centers and the fact the grid is not capable of serving the demand right now. So small scale solutions that are attached to the data centers around the AI growth. So anyway, I was just curious. I know it's really hard to predict how long it's going to take for new technology to come along, but it does seem like there will be funds and pressure to explore that could be better choices than this here in the next 3 to 5 years.
One of the reasons that we recommended this option and at the time, 6 months ago, was because it's not a complete solution, right? The other options were basically putting all your eggs in one basket. That's what we're going with. We're going to be using that system for the next 50, 75, 100 plus years. This option is a partial solution. And we recommended it, at least at the time, in anticipation of additional new technologies coming down the pipe. Okay, a few updates for you all that you may not have been privy to. Just so this is the result of some 10 weeks of analysis that we hired a consultant to give us some more understanding of what it means to install this electric steam boiler. So this was as we completed a schematic design. There's basically two, maybe three things to point you to. The first, when we brought this to your attention 6-8 months ago, we thought that we would recommend an 8-megawatt boiler. Some additional analysis points to the or suggests that a 12-megawatt boiler would be a better fit for us. And not that we use it at that full capacity all the time. It would just mostly be used at 8 megawatts with the ability to ramp it up for very short periods of time. I could go into the reasons why, but
You're not going to have time for that. Just hit the
But
key.
there are good reasons to do that. It doesn't change the economics in any meaningful way, but it gives us some advantage to be able to ramp up and down for short periods of time. And then the other is we thought at the time it would go into an existing building space. And after some engineering analysis, we decided it's actually cheaper to put it in a new facility, a new building space immediately adjacent to where we had originally thought. So again, happy to go into those details, but they generally both of these things lower cost over the longer term. And then as Brian alluded already, we have sort of factored in what we think is the cost to erect that building, buy the electrode boiler. You see at 17.5 million, 1.2 million annual cost. And then we also looked at what the impact is on our existing capacity to receive power from EWEB. And as I think Jamie said earlier, we would have to increase our substation capacity as a result of this electrode boiler in the mid-2030s.
Right. It is my job to spend just a few minutes talking about the finances of this. I'm going to walk through an analysis that we have done, an orientation to the chart, and then I'll get to the data that sits in it. The upper two horizontal rows are systems as usual. This is if we were to maintain our current natural gas heating system, the anticipated cost for running the heating system on campus over between now and fiscal year 2033. Our assumption is if we were to move ahead with an electrode steam boiler, that it would begin full-scale operations in fiscal year 28. So we've taken 5 years after that to provide this body an understanding of where we'd anticipate cost moving. The middle two, ESB, refer to an electrode steam boiler, and this would be the estimated cost of the operations and debt service associated with running an electrode steam boiler. Again, you'll see a notch up in fiscal year 28 when the boilers would come into service. The bottom two are the marginal cost at the kind of lowest estimated rate, and then at the baseline. We've run different permutations of this. You could honestly run millions of this. None of us know exactly what the operating costs in the future would be. I'm going to talk in a moment about what assumptions we.
Brian, if you just
get
jump to the punchline for the group, give us the actual number. You guys see these numbers all the time. We're looking at all these. Just tell us the answer.
Yeah, our expectation is if you'd move to an electrode steam boiler, it would cost between $3.5 and $5.5 million incremental above the cost of our current heating system. That includes debt service on the boilers. And again, keep in the back of your mind that when you get into the mid-2030s, we would have another investment in the substation that would add on between 1.8 and $2 million in incremental debt service on top.
So just say another 2 million. What year was that happens?
In mid-2030s, I think it's 2036 to 2038.
10, 12 years.
Yep.
Okay.
But it is important. I just want to make sure people understand that's an annual recurring cost increase. It's not a one-time cost increase.
Sometimes it's easier in graphic form. I will note that our cost for running the natural gas boilers will increase as hedges that we entered into over the last several years roll off. Even when those hedges roll off, we anticipate that the electricity cost of running electric steam boilers would be significantly higher than our current system.
I can't remember when we got the report, the task force report. You know, the priority of some of the stakeholders is to reduce the operational emissions. We consider or price out carbon markets as a potential solution.
We did include that in the report, so I don't think you would have seen it in the report that we shared with you. We did investigate some of that offline. We've generally decided not to pursue it because the feedback we got from the campus community is that that they would rather see the money invested to improve our systems than to write a check to some third party elsewhere.
I did want to note as we look at the operating costs, we are currently in negotiations with eWeb on our rate structure in the future. So these numbers have some ambiguity. They have indicated to us that their pricing from BPA will be increasing pretty significantly in the next couple of years. So we could layer on additional costs on top of this. We expect now at least several $100,000.
The best we know at this time.
Best we know at this time.
And we're assuming the cost for natural gas is going down.
No, we're assuming that it is increasing significantly, partly because our hedges, which are way under market at this moment, are rolling off, and then have used the forward price curve for the upcoming years.
Even with the administration potentially putting a thumb on that, the new administration.
That's a thing we're looking at right now, but that gets into a whole level of uncertainty. But what we know to expect at this point in time is our natural gas costs going to increase about 2 to 3x. But what Brian is sharing with you is the delta, even with that, between the expected increase in natural gas and the expected electricity cost should we go with this electric boiler.
So it's factored in.
It is. It's all baked in.
The midpoint, just for baseline here, the midpoint from what you said, operating costs would be up 4.5 million based on what we know now. That's the midpoint of your estimate. And in 2036, it would go up an additional 2 million. I'm assuming that's in today's dollars.
We have not discounted back, so it's nominal figures.
I mean, we don't know what it's going to cost in 2036. Yeah.
And let me just ask one clarifying. We haven't factored in, if we look at the system as usual, if the current administration ramps up natural gas production, which could bring the cost down, that is not factored in.
It is not.
Yeah, but it's important to say though that most of our natural gas in the Northwest comes from Canada, so it's not actually affected all that greatly by what happens in the United States.
Well, it could be affected by tariffs.
Yeah, or just the market. 10 minutes left.
All right. So what you've got here is really meant just to be more of a little bit of a reminder of our financial situation. So we pulled these from the long-term projections that we ran through with you in September, and just a reminder that we just are in a very tough financial situation. These numbers are the base case, which was not the hey, we get back to our enrollment targets, but it was also not the flat numbers. It was we get maybe halfway there. And depending on what you assume for tuition increases as of the fall, the range for where we were in 5 years was somewhere between -8 million and +3.7. I will say since the fall, our numbers have shifted by almost $10 million to the negative because of compensation issues. And so this is just a reminder in some ways of the fact that we are in a baseline challenging financial situation, as we've talked about with this year being in a situation where it looks like expenses are about 2.3 million higher than revenue given current projections.
And what we have done on the next slide is put forward not recommendations, but just to sort of provide some information for this group on if we were to fund the incremental cost of this program by different methods, what would that entail? So the first of which, recognizing that most of the institution's costs are in personnel, what's the equivalent of the incremental $5 to $5.3 million worth of cost in terms of personnel? Beginning in fiscal year 28, it's about 35 employees, kind of plus or minus there. But the equivalent cost, again, of $5 million is about 34 employees, 35 employees. So if we were to incur additional costs, no additional resources, we would need to find that space one way or another in our budget.
One way would be to remove 34 jobs.
That's exactly right. A second way is if we were to increase revenue through something like a sustainability fee, and we layered that in over years. Remember, we have a 5-year tuition guarantee, so revenue comes in sort of slowly over time, but then builds up after 5 years to full carrying cost. It would be about $180 per year, about $60 a term for every student. And again, that would layer in, and over time would be about $5 million worth of revenue, and then increase at a couple percent a year.
That would be added as a fee, not in tuition.
It would be added as a fee, yes. But couldn't be added all at once. It would need to layer in over time. And then the last component of this is every year we have or most years we have run a strategic investment process that has been about $2 million. Some years we have paused that when we've been in hard financial straits. This year it will be $1 million for administrative type increases. And so what we have done here is provide an example of layering in every year about $1 million from that strategic investment process to fund this for 5 years until we build up to the total incremental annual cost, and then some additional layering on as we see inflationary increases every year. So this would take about a half of what had historically been set aside for new strategic investments at the institution.
What are examples of, 2 examples of strategic investments we made that might be an opportunity cost we would have by not having that money go towards those types of things?
I think 2 that we have made over the prior years, pretty significant investments in cybersecurity, infrastructure, and personnel across the institution. Or this year, I believe we approved several $100,000 for a food pantry for our students.
So I'm just going to wrap it up with one final slide. We were just trying to summarize kind of the situation that we're in. So basically, I think, and this takes it to a very high level, but as you're all aware, our current financial position is pretty challenging. We are estimating that boiler at somewhere between 3.5 and 5.4 million annually of increased cost, and then it does increase from there. That does not include the substation. There are options to fund it. We tried to think of different things that we could do. The challenge is that they all do have a cost. So if we're going to do cost cutting, it's going to affect people. If we're going to add a fee, it's going to affect students in terms of their total tuition and fees. If we look at our strategic investment process, it means we're prioritizing this over other strategic priorities of the institution. We could consider, there are alternative projects that we could consider to the electric steam boiler. The issue is though that none would have the same immediate magnitude of emissions. In fact, there are things that we could do, but we've done a lot of the low hanging fruit already. And so while we have some ideas, they are not of the same magnitude to be as forthright about this as we can. So that is the situation we find ourselves in. That's the update of the work that we've done to try to better understand what this could look like and the impacts if we were to move forward.
Reminder to everybody, we're not voting on anything today. This is for information to keep it top of mind. And we'd like to hear from Cy and Ruby and David when we talk about raising fees. What's your reaction? What does that hit you? Start with Ruby.
Yeah, I mean, raising fees is always a challenge for tuition. We're thinking about our other strategic initiatives, which are basic needs. So you're investing in that, but then you're raising fees. So then you're going to want to invest more in basic needs. So it's constantly kind of a battle between those two things. I think for this project specifically, there's students who are extremely passionate about it, but they don't understand this full scope that we're situated in. And so I don't know, when we say we're raising fees to them, to my peers, rest of the students, I think that we might not fully understand that what that really means, connect all the dots. And I think it's just, you have to understand not just to yourself, but how that impacts the broader university. And so I don't know, it's tough situation to be in.
Right, David?
I think Ruby summarized it pretty well. My also other reaction is why am I doing it? Why is the state not paying for it, or why isn't there some benefactor? That's kind of what I would.
Yeah, fees are never popular. It's the sort of thing, like if there is the large upswelling and kind of ground effort that there is for this sort of on campus, it's basically it gets people on board. Like this is going to have a cost. This is a very direct cost, and that can be messaged. And I think that almost might be a good way to gauge how much on the ground support there is for this, because on the surface level, as everybody I talk to now very much believes in this and recognizes this as something that needs investment and understands that theoretically. But then fees again make it real. But again, there might be appetite for that. It depends on how people care.
Those are all great answers and it's good feedback. Yeah, Dennis.
No, there's no, there's no decision today.
Right. This is just discussion.
Yeah. In the future, whenever a decision might come before us, I think we'll hear the task force, the update that,
Dennis, can you speak into your mic?
Yeah, sorry. I know that the priority or the emphasis was on, what can we do to reduce our operational, the actual emissions we're putting out. And that makes a lot of sense. It gives us a lot of specific costs we can look at. I think as fiduciaries, it would be really helpful for me to understand what pricing out carbon credits would be to help us make a more informed decision in the future. I just think it's given the cost we're looking at, I think it would be something that's be helpful to have.
Thanks, David.
Just want to say in support.
You speaking, everybody, when you're going to talk, pull it all the way into you, and it helps everybody, actually. Yeah.
I just wanted to say in support of fees, though, students do pay an fee every quarter that results in like what $10 million annually for student engagement. So there is some support for fees, even if it's maybe just because it has been over and over again. But just wanted to make the point.
Yeah.
Fees have been accepted.
Can I ask a quick question
Yep,
about fees? And Jamie, can you remind me, when we look at tuition every March, we often compare ourselves to our peers and like how our new tuition will stack up. Do we do the same for fees?
Yeah, so we usually look at tuition and fees, and then we also are trying to also look at total cost of education, because there's also a question of housing and books
Yep.
and those other things. But there's no question that if you think about it, it impacts the student's total cost. So this could be a fee, it could be a increased tuition beyond what you would otherwise do to try to pull funds out, but it's gonna, I think, affect the analysis the same way, because it basically are additional funds the student needs to pay, and then they're looking
Right.
at other institutions of what's the total cost of going to other institutions.
Perfect, thank
comparatively.
you.
Anybody else have a comment? For me, I've shared three things. This is it's a hot issue. It falls underneath kind of flourishing, right? For a lot of students, this is really important. Faculty, alums is really important. For others, they may not care as much. And then it always comes down to who's going to pay for it. It'd be nice and it'd be easier, frankly, if this was mandated by the state and they had dollars that came with it and that paid for it. I just want to say, for me, there are three things that I think are important that we talk about here. One's academic advancement. We're here to educate students and release them into the world and have them make this a better place. Two is we have a lot of faculty, staff, we have employment, we have jobs. We hear numbers about cutting people to do this, and I'm not sure that that is going to help with academic advancement. And the third one is student enrollment. So we talk about fees and the sensitivity to raising fees and how does that affect enrollment. We just watch presentations about, boy, when we have enrollment go down like this year, what happens? So finding a solution to this is going to make some hard decisions. And I know for me, it's hard to compromise those. It's hard to say we're going to terminate faculty or we're going to reduce 34 positions for that. It's hard to say we're going to reduce academic advancement. It's hard to say we're going to compromise enrollment potentially if we raise our fees, and we don't know what that answer is. The feedback everybody gave is really helpful, and we're gonna need to make a decision on this at some point. We don't have a date on that, but it's appreciative how everybody is so well informed to understand the yin and yang of this. Thank you. Next up are audited financial statements, and Jamie and Kelly. And then Matt Parsons, you will be giving a report as well.
So while folks are getting situated, I'm just going to say a couple words and pass it off to Kelly. So one thing to keep in mind as you hear about the numbers here is they are going to be a different lens on our expenses and our revenue than we normally talk about, because normally we talk about the education and general fund budget, the E&G fund budget. And when we look at our audited financial statements, these numbers represent pulling everything together. So pulls together not just our tuition, our state appropriation, but our auxiliaries like housing and athletics and our grant funds and our gift funds. It's all pulled together. And so while it gives you a comprehensive look, you need to, I'd advise you to keep in mind that these funds are all in different groups with different restrictions on them. And so there's sometimes a challenge of seeing them all pulled together. But hopefully this gives you a picture of what everything looks like, and we're happy to answer questions as we go.
Great, thank you. Good afternoon. So jump into it. These are for the fiscal year ending June 30, 2024. We published our financial statements right at the beginning of November. The old joke is it's an annual process that takes 18 months. So you're going to hear more from Matt in just a few minutes, but I am pleased to once again bring you a clean audit report. There are no significant deficiencies or material weaknesses in our financial statements. So that is the expectation, and that's what we bring you. I'd like to give a quick shout out to my team in business affairs, who is the end point of the processes that bring all these numbers together and compile the financials, but also a big shout out to all the financial professionals on campus who enter these transactions and track them and do a lot of accounting and finance work. So it's a huge group effort. So many thanks to all those folks as well. We had no new statements or no new pronouncements from the Governmental Accounting Standards Board, or GASB, that we had to implement this year. So nothing changed in the financial statements that you've seen in the past. And we'd just like to keep a track on the pension and other pension obligations, other post-employment benefit liabilities that we have to carry on our books. It's a percentage that's allocated to us of the state's pension liability. Hit 212.8 million this year, the liability that we are carrying on our books for that. Without the side account that we invested in, that would be about $72 million higher. So that's our portion of the state. Overall revenues increased $133 million this year on your financial statements. Big changes in capital and non-capital gifts, which are the top two line items in there. And a large increase in large decrease from the government appropriation year over year. And that's because we had some large one-time investments from the state in FY23, which is why you saw the big downturn. Operating expenses increased 156.4 million year over year. The largest portion of that is in compensation and benefits, and we're going to talk in more detail in just a slide or two. And I will keep going, so please jump in with questions. Here we're taking a look at sources of revenue and the trends year over year, or over a 4-year trend line, I'm sorry. We calculate a CAGR, or compound annual growth rate. So our compound annual growth rate in revenues was 11.9% over the 4-year term. It should be noted that FY21 was the first full year of the pandemic. So revenues were pretty low, especially in our auxiliary operations, which is in the purple line on this chart. Very top portion of our bar here, the salmon color, are capital grants and gifts, and those are very variable year over year and are not recurring.
Would you just quickly tell us, because it's hard to see these colors, start at the bottom in 2024 and go by those colors all the way up?
Sure. So starting at the bottom is student tuition and fees.
Yep.
Then red is grants and contracts. A very thin green line is educational sales and services. That's just miscellaneous sales that happen on campus. The purple block is auxiliary enterprises. And we have kind of a bluish turquoise, which are our government appropriations. Orange, thin line, is investment activity. The kind of lavender is other revenue, just miscellaneous things that happen. And then the very top salmon color are capital grants and gifts.
Once again, on the auxiliary, you mentioned what that was. So what is the auxiliary?
Sorry, say again?
You mentioned auxiliary earlier. What makes that up? What
Housing, athletics,
housing.
the EMU, student rec center.
That's where the most of the growth appears to have come.
Yeah, from 21 was the pandemic year, so most of those were shut down. And 24 represents a 10.2% increase over 23 in that overall. Next, looking at our expenses by natural class, and I will do the same, looking at the 24 blocks. The first big blue block on the bottom is compensation and benefits. You'll see a very thin little red line, which represents the change in our OPEB liabilities on the state, or our pension and OPEB liabilities. You'll see a green, which is expenses related to just services and supplies. The purple line are scholarships and fellowships, and these are reported a little bit differently than what you see on the E&G. The amount of internal and external aid, student aid that is applied to tuition is actually negative to it, negative revenue on the previous slide. This is money that typically is refunded to students, goes into their pockets for housing or books or any other kind of aid. The turquoise is depreciation and amortization, so a non-cash expense. Orange is a just other expenses on top of that, and then it's very, very thin. You can't even see it on the slide. And then on top of that is interest expense that we pay out for our external debt.
How big is the green?
The green being services and supplies.
Yeah.
I don't have that number directly in front of me.
Do we have a standard set of terms that we provide to our vendors?
Yes, we have standard terms and conditions on all of our contracted information.
How quickly do we pay vendors?
Our basis is a net 30. And the goal is to maintain the cash in our accounts as long as possible to maximize interest earnings.
Looks like it's about, that is on the left margin, is that actual number or just a, is that a dollar amount?
Those are
or is that
dollars.
just a range? That's just a range. It's
Yes.
Not actual dollars. It's just-
And
Is it dollars? Okay.
it is dollars.
The range
Yes.
of dollars.
Well, it's gotta be like 25, 35, 30 million. Maybe more than that. Maybe more than that. Hundreds.
More than that.
300 million.
Yep.
250 million.
We did a breakdown of this. It was the metric, quarterly metric, maybe 3 quarters ago, where it was hundreds of millions of dollars when you looked at it across, but then it included a lot of different things in there that we kind of parsed apart.
Well, we've looked at it as a way, and Tim has brought this up, as there a place for savings there, you know, can you save 10% is a big number.
In 2024, it was 250.8 million. And compensation and benefits, just looking at this, is about 65% of our expenses, and that is all fund groups, not just ENG. And 24 was a 13.5% increase over 23, and an 8.0% compound annual growth, again, starting at the pandemic year. So that's
We're asking you too many questions to let you get through your slides. So
it's your meeting.
Yeah, I know, but we've already taken your 10. But
Okay,
go
sorry.
ahead. Hit your high points.
Total net position, assets less liabilities, is showing on this slide. Our invested in capital assets, which is the huge blue block at the bottom, represents 90% of our net position. Again, if we did not have the GASB liability in our books, we would be a little bit higher, $212 million in net position. So quickly, capital asset, go ahead.
Lean in.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Move the mic in front of you, so you don't have to. Right in.
All right, there we go. My showbiz years. Capital assets are right about $2.4 billion worth, and there's about $953 million worth of capital debt against that on June 30. This is just a 4-year summary of our cash flow. Again, this is cash only, no investments showing here. Showing sources and uses. And then we get into the ratios that we typically show at this. It should be noted that these ratios do include foundation assets, and foundation assets are typically very restricted, so we cannot use them just for general operational purposes. And
I just have to say something. I know we're running late. We share these with you because they're industry standard metrics. The HEC focuses on them. I think for the reasons Kelly talked about, that they include foundation reserved assets. Sometimes they include pledges that aren't even cash. You have to take them with a grain of salt in terms of what they're conveying, but they are used in the industry, which is why we're showing them to you.
As you go through them, Kelly, just if you tell us what we need to know about any one of these particular things.
Will do. So the first is primary reserve. This shows how long the university could function without bringing in any new revenues. I refer to it as the Hurricane Katrina revenue because the schools there had to shut down after the hurricane. Blue line is our annual ratio. Red is the 3-year average. Green is the average of our AAU publics. And then the black line is the recommended threshold. You can see we are above the threshold and in with our peers for all years, or for this past year. The next is the viability ratio. This is a ratio that shows, do we have the ability to settle all of our long-term debts at June 30. Just in case we had to shut the doors, it's a ratio 1-to-1 is what's recommended. You can see we are just above the 1-to-1 ratio here, well below our peers, which are typically at a 2-to-1 of assets versus liabilities. Return on net assets shows how well we utilized our assets over the course of the year. We hit a stabilization point between 23 and 24 and are meeting with our peers there as well. And then finally, the debt burden ratio was mentioned earlier in Mike's presentation. And this is just a graphic to show that we are right in that 5.5, 5.6 area. We are well below the 0.07 that is the recommended threshold. We do not have peer comparisons because it requires a deeper dig than what is available on their public financial statements. And then finally, just on the horizon, next year is the GASB Statement 101 is scheduled to come in. I was very ready to work with my auditors to present them an analysis of the impact. However, they are revising their guidance and we should be hearing more coming soon. So this may not be applicable to us because of the condition in their statement that says whether it is more likely than not this liability exists.
Thank you, Kelly.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jamie. Appreciate it. Matt Parsons is our auditor. He's a partner at Moss Adams. New last year. Isn't that right?
Correct.
They automatically change partners doing this for objectivity. And we're going to throw a curve at you. We want you to start with a punchline.
Okay.
And then we want you to give us the detail.
Sounds great.
A little bit. Yeah, we're going to compliment your sport coat.
Excellent. Thank you so much for having me. And as you mentioned, this is my second year having the opportunity to work with the university. As always, it's been a great opportunity. We really appreciate all the hard work. As Kelly mentioned, it does feel like an 18-month process, and that's not true. It's a lot of planning involved to really ensure that we're able to get to this point today to present these results to you. I will try to get to those punches as quickly as possible. I know we're short for time. I think the most important thing to know is in our engagement letter every year, we highlight, what have we been asked to do for you. There's been no deviations to that original plan as outlined. One thing that's important, I think, for you to know is we don't perform any non-attest or non-audit services for the university. That's really important because if we do, potentially that could impair our independence. And I would say there's plenty of universities where we're asked to draft the financial statements or prepare certain documents because they can't get them to that final finish line on their own. That's not the case with the University of Oregon. So really big compliments to the team here. This scope also covers the KWACS, the radio station audit as well, and we also perform procedures under the NCAA guidelines that's required because of your Division I status. And all of those reports came back with clean results as well. It's important to note that we do not audit the foundation, and that's obviously a big part of what you evaluate every year. We rely on the use of other auditors that perform that engagement. So those are incorporated by reference in our audit report that just make note that we didn't do that. We are providing an unmodified or clean opinion on the financial statements, which I know is your expectation. The last several years, there's been some pretty big standards that have been required to be adopted. And so we've had some additional disclosure information to kind of highlight those to the readers. This year, as Kelly mentioned, there were no new standards. So it's a very clean, straightforward standard opinion that you would see anywhere else. In addition to that, we provide two other reports. The first one being essentially your management letter. So this is required under government auditing standards to highlight if we had significant audit adjustments that we identified, we had lapses of segregation of duties, we saw significant control deficiency across the board, this would be outlined in this report. And as Kelly mentioned earlier, there were nothing to rise to that level. Certainly we always share best practices, and I have another slide here coming up with some minor areas that we did talk about, but just to be kind of that additional confidence that there were no reporting findings. We also test the compliance of two other major programs. Typically, student financial assistance cluster is always a big one. We were able to give them a break this year, which thank goodness, because we know with the challenges going on within the FAFSA, and yeah, it was a good time for them to be able to have a little breather. We did focus on your research and development cluster. Last time we audited that was back in 2022. We did have some comments and recommendations that came out of the audit that year. And so we always follow up the year after, but always want to make sure when we come back again to really test it, are they still fulfilling those obligations that we asked them to do back then? And so we're happy to report that we had no compliance findings on the R&D program this year. And then also more importantly, you had a program that was new this year that rose over $3 million, which required us to test, which was the special education technical assistance to improve services to children with disabilities. It's a mouthful. But whenever a new program that's never been audited comes under scope, I know it's a lot of concern because they just have never had to go through that type of engagement process before. But I think it's really complimentary to your team that you're able to get through that audit and have no compliance findings there as well. We always want to talk about what are the top 5 areas that we think that University of Oregon is doing really well in and succeeding. Again, I mentioned the financial reporting aspect a little bit earlier. There's a really great team that you have on board that's able to do the research when a new statement does occur and you need to adopt that or have new PERS funding or new information from the state. How do you actually disclose that in your financials? And your team does a really good job at that. On the IT controls and evaluation, this is not related to cybersecurity, just simply when it comes to the ability to provide information that gets to your financial reporting metrics, right? So if there's been a change in accounting system, if there's been security and access assigned to different users that have an ability to modify financial reporting, your team has done a really good job documenting their processes, understanding what goes into a sandbox before it's fully tested and implemented. They review SOC reports, which are basically audits done with third-party agencies, and have good documentation in place to really make sure that they're understanding when your information leaves the university, how is it being handled, and are you doing the responsible things that you need to make sure that it's not going to change your financial reporting. On the governance side of things, I mean, it's always a hard blend of is the trustees involved too much or not enough, right? And so we always look
Charles
to
says too much.
it's a delicate balance. So we definitely think compared to what we see within the industry, you are doing the right things. You are asking the right questions, but letting management do the responsibility and providing the answers to those. So I thought that was a compliment. Your capital asset activity, you have a lot of stuff going on in your capital assets. A lot of projects in the horizon, and it's hard to stay organized when you have that much information flowing through your systems. And so when we ask a question, we get really good detailed responses with all the backup and support that we need. That's not always the case. It's hard to find systems that can really track this information correctly and give you the output of, is this a quality? Is it need to be repaired soon? Is it, something that's where we know we have on our deferred maintenance list? And then lastly, I know it's a little bit of a double-edged sword, but the days cash on hand. I mean, I think you to your counterparts, you've been really good to maintain the amount of cash that you need to really be able to provide for operating expenses. I think that's something to really compliment. So now getting to the areas of your consideration, I won't say that these are all negatives, but just something to be aware of. When we go through your research and development cluster every year, we survey a significant number of the principal investigators that conduct the actual research. And although the responses were very positive, they would like more training. I think there's always this concern. There's so much compliance out there, so much risk that falls on their shoulders. They want to have additional confidence that what they're doing is truly correct and accurate. And so we've had these conversations with Valerie Whelan, who's the director for special projects. And so she's on board and is be working with them to make sure that that exists. We also want to make sure that the coding, so when you apply for a grant in research area, that you are setting it up correctly within your system so that it flows through all the different categories correctly so that you have the right way to sift through that information when you need to classify something as research or non-research related. Policy review. We know during the pandemic, historically, the university has every 5 years or so revisited your policies and procedures to update them based on what you're actually doing. I think because of the pandemic, some of these are aging a little bit beyond sort of that 5-year trajectory. And so obviously probably not a lot has changed, but we definitely recommend that you go back and revisit some of those as well and maybe update for, what is currently some best practices. And we have some thoughts that we've shared with the management team on some of those bullet points that would be good. And then on your equipment inventory items, this is a lot of data. We were able to get everything we need to be able to do our testing, but it took some manipulation, massaging of the data to be able to identify what we needed to do for our testing. And so just think there could be a little bit better of tracking and linking some of the awards. It's partially due to system limitations of how many certain tags you can put on all of the different reporting elements. But just wanted to bring that to your attention and know that that's something that's already been addressed. And then finally, when we look at your contributions, right? There's a lot of great contributions, a lot of great support to the university. And we know you're probably embarking here on a capital campaign in the near future. Obviously, your concentration compared to some of your peers, to some large significant donors, is higher than others. So just want to make sure that you're aware of that as you're, expanding your reach, probably not preaching to the choir here, your other alumni, things like that. Any questions related to those?
We're fine with the concentration as opposed to getting it more spread out by having to go down lower.
I agree.
But it is a good warning about not, can't rely on that for, forever. So that's a good point, but we're fortunate.
Exactly. I don't know how much more time I have. I just want to give you a couple additional slides of things we're seeing in the industry.
You're going to say one thing on each slide, and you've done a great job, by the way.
Oh, thank you. Every year, higher education does a deep dive where they look at what are those trends to be looking for. I won't read all these. Obviously, the FAFSA debacle challenging has been really top of mind for many institutions. The other area is the security over OPMs, so online program management companies. These are third parties that potentially have information of data of your students. And so there's been a lot of scrutiny what the Department of Education would be doing over those agencies. There was a recent mandate that basically reversed some decisions that they were going to be auditing them at the same level as a public institution. And that reach, if you will, has been revised, but it still doesn't take away the concern. Data is important to be secured, and how is it going out to third parties is an area of focus, not only by Department of Education, but I think really all of us. Every year, the United Educators does a survey of university presidents of their top 3 to 5 things that they see as the biggest risk. I don't think this is any surprise with data security being number 1. It's the first time we've seen it rise to the number 1 spot in the last several years. Enrollment and recruiting and hiring continue to be other big trends, of course, that we're seeing, which obviously is not unique just to University of Oregon, but again, the whole industry. These are another survey of what is affecting leaders within the higher education business. So investing in essential technology, maintaining workforce, very similar themes to what we saw in the previous slide. And I did prepare a few key ratios that we see. We talked about the positive rating that we got from Moody's and S&P. These are some ratios that we know that they look at. They mirror very much things that you've already discussed here this afternoon, so I won't go into them in a lot of detail unless you have specific questions. We did try to benchmark against some other organizations or universities that are here locally in your area, as well as those that are in the US News ranked report based on similar undergraduate enrollment sizes and maybe some targets of your ranking movement. The first one being your spendable cash to investments of your total debt. I know there's already been a lot of conversation. Obviously, University of Oregon has a little bit higher debt than significant number of peers, so it's not a big surprise that your ratios here are a little bit smaller than some of these other peers, except for maybe OSU. I think the important thing to be aware of here is that if you did include the foundation, your spendable cash investments would be almost 3.53. So it would be a significant impact. And I think we heard about the data is not always comparable when you look at every institution across. Certainly, we've excluded all the foundation activity from this report from your peers, but every other school uses their foundation slightly differently, right? So it's important when you're looking at apples to apples comparisons. Certainly, we know the annual operating margin. This is just a good reminder that certainly the university would not exist on its own without the state support. I think we're already aware of that, but you're not alone. Every public institution across the country is relying on their state support and capital grants. I think the bigger thing here is a trend line. So looking from 2021, which of course was the pandemic year, so your operating margin was quite low, but we're building back to that threshold. I know we decreased partially a little bit because of some HERF funding, which was able to be considered in operating funds. But overall, I think it's an area that echoes what Jamie already mentioned as far as trying to recoup some of these losses going forward. The return on net position, this is a standard that basically looks at your average net position at the beginning of the year and end of the year, and what was the change. So the bigger your net position grows, which a lot of it is related to capital items, this number is harder to make grow over time. And so this trend, obviously, again, goes in hand with a little bit with some of the pandemic funding that we saw and other supplemental funding that the state provided. But it is something to managing and comparing to your peers as well. And then the last slide here was just looking at your tuition and auxiliary income. We talked about auxiliary being, housing and other support. How does this compare to your total operating revenue? And so are you more tuition and auxiliary revenue dependent or not? And you can see you are slightly above those of your peers. I mean,
Slightly?
slightly. I was being complimentary, but you're right. The other big factor here is that if there is a medical school present, obviously patient revenue drives a lot about and deferring other costs. So that's something that a couple of obviously your other peers have, not all of them, but certainly something to be mindful of as you look to the future is diversifying those operating revenue streams.
Oregon State's the only one there that doesn't, other than us, I think.
Yeah.
of Those. And they get an extra 200 million from the state.
As I just learned, yeah.
Which makes some of that difference, yeah.
Yep.
Any questions for Matt? You did make a really good presentation. You had some good information and you packed it all in a short amount of time. So we appreciate that.
Perfect. Thank you so much
All
for
right,
having me.
Thank you. Okay, we are gonna take a 10-minute break till 3:05. And then we're gonna come back for a very interesting presentation. I know you'll feel free. All right. Yeah. Meant to mention when Tim Boyle came in to say, welcome. It's good to have you here. I know you worked hard to get back, so we appreciate that.
Wasn't easy.
All right, we have a really interesting presentation, and I'm going to turn it over to Carl to make the introduction, and then we're going to sit back and listen.
It's really fun to be in this seat where I have an opportunity to introduce a good friend of mine. And I kind of wanted to turn this into a little bit of a roast, but that's probably not appropriate for a board meeting. And so Ken Goldstein and I have been friends and professional colleagues for several decades now. We were both professors at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Ken, political science professor. I taught economics. Ken has sort of a restless intellect, or some would say can't keep a job. And so he has tremendous experience in not only, unlike most academics, in both the private sector, public sector, and at universities. And so after leaving UW-Madison, he's had positions as a vice president with Kantar Media, one of the big advertising marketing analytics companies in the country. He's had academic positions at University of San Francisco. He's consulted with governments around the world and across the United States. He's probably best known these days for two things. He is at the election desk on ABC News on election nights, and has been doing that for a long time. And a lot of the interesting polling results that come out of ABC Sunday Morning comes from Ken. In higher education, he's very well known across the AAU. He was the vice president of strategic communications and marketing with the AAU. He does extensive polling for the AAU, and he's been kind enough to do that for us at the University of Oregon. And his kindness is quite extraordinary, because one of the first phone calls I got after being named the president of the University of Oregon was from Ken Goldstein. And it wasn't congratulations. It was, you've got to appoint me as offensive coordinator for the football team, because Ken is a serious football fan. I tried to explain to him that Coach Lanning was doing pretty well, and Will Stein had one of the finest offenses in collegiate football. And I got the lecture, Carl, as president, you have got to make some tough decisions. And I still wouldn't succumb. But Ken has become a great fan of the University of Oregon, as well as he's just a fantastic scholar and leader in higher education. And so I'm thrilled to have Ken, and of course our wonderful Vice President for Communications and Marketing, Carol Keys, do the Ken and Carol show. And so I can't tell you how excited I am for the next hour and a half.
Thank you, Carl. So it is the Ken and Carol show, but Ken is the star guest here. So he's going to go first, and then have some time for you to engage and ask him follow-up questions, and then I'll have a shorter segment after that, and then also have questions for that too.
Great. Well, thanks to Carl for the mostly kind words. And everyone always says it's really great to be here, but it really is. I've obviously known Carl for many years. Was tremendously proud of him when he got this position, and one of the great jobs is to be the good friend of the president of the University of Oregon. And so go Ducks! I am fully on the bandwagon. Let me jump in here and share some polling that I have done for the University of Oregon. I'm also happy to answer any questions that you might have. What I do at the AAU, or what I did at the AAU, was polling on behalf of AAU in general, America's leading research universities, of which the University of Oregon is one of those leading research universities. There's 69 in the United States of America, and then two Canadian institutions. But then over the years, I've also done individual polling for about 40 different AAU institutions. And so I don't share your individual details with the other institutions, and I can't share their individual details with you, but I'm doing lots of work in this space, in this area, and sometimes I'll put a result in context for you. But let me start here by first going over some data that are not mine. But these are data that many of you have probably seen before. These I see, some of my administrator friends here, and this is the sort of thing that goes flying across the emails of University of Administrators. And if they didn't see it, it's the sort of things that chairs of the Board of Trustees immediately send to them and say, "Hey, Carl, did you see this?" So Gallup is obviously a very well-known, prestigious survey research organization. Every year, they report Americans' confidence in a variety of institutions. Episodically, they ask about higher education. So they don't ask about higher education every year. They asked about higher education in 2015. They asked about higher education in 2018. They asked about higher education in 2023. There's actually some updated data where, not surprisingly, after the year that higher education had in 2023, they also asked about it in 2024. But the results are very similar. And I guess one can look at this, and if you're a glass half full or a glass half empty sort of person, I will give you both perspectives, but then spend a little bit of more time about why I tend to focus on this a bit with folks like Carl and the other chancellors and presidents at the AAU. So the first thing is, if you noticed, we call AAU America's Leading Research Universities. Any of you have done politics or media, or any folks in the back here who've done it? If that sounds poll tested to you, it's because it was. And it turns out that Americans understand there's many great institutions in this country. Different institutions have different missions, but Americans understand also the value of institutions that do this, do most of the research in this country. In most of our polling, we find that higher education or higher education system, as some people talk about it, are not particularly popular. And again, if you could think of a worse way of describing us as higher education system, let me know, because it sounds sort of sterile at best, military industrial complex system at worst. But this is what Gallup asks, and they've asked this over the years. So we have some time series, and as nerdy political scientists or survey research like myself say, the trend is your friend. And and the trend might not be your friend here. What you see here, which sometimes surprises people, is higher education is fourth here. Okay, so Carl, I'm not sure you should have introduced me talking about all my work with television news, because as your eyes keep going all the way down to the bottom. Television news is at the very low end there. In fact, television news, of course, could not have gone down as much as higher education has gone down, because that would have been mathematically impossible, because it was already lower than the amount that higher education decreased. So on the glass half full, higher education remains at the top end of institutions where Americans have confidence. We shouldn't forget on college campuses that small business, the military, the police are the most popular institutions in this country. That said, that decline among higher education, and I'm going to quibble a little bit with the question here, and I'll talk about that. I can quibble with calling it higher education. That is a tremendous headwind that you are facing. So I'm here to talk about the University of Oregon. I'm here to talk about what I found about the University of Oregon. We're going to do the Carol and Ken show about some things you can do to help tell the story of the University of Oregon. But you are facing tremendous headwinds in terms of public perception towards higher education. Sometimes it's things higher education has done, sometimes it's fair, sometimes it's unfair, but unequivocally, you are facing very, very big headwinds and a very, very challenging national context. Now, my other little quibble with this question, and then don't worry about it for those of you who know that I'm the only person standing between you and cocktail hour. We're not going to spend 15 minutes on every one of these slides, just on this slide. I don't love the question. Confidence. Well, confidence to do what? And so at the national level and also in work we've done with individual institutions, when you ask about specific things, like do you have confidence in America's leading research universities to educate students, get students jobs, find important research discoveries that can help people's health and livelihood, yes, people will say they have greater confidence in the institution. Where people don't have as much confidence, and again, this is not Oregon specific, but just speaking to the headwind that you are in, tremendous anxiety about accessibility and affordability of our great institutions. So I'm going to make a wild guess that some of you watch college football on television from time to time, if you are not actually in the stadium. If you notice recently, there's been a Buffalo Wild Wings ad that's been airing during NFL games and also college football games. And the Buffalo Wild Wings ad is half-price beer and wings on Tuesday. You'll save so much money, you can afford college. Just joking, no one can afford college. So we're even getting trashed by the Buffalo. Okay. But again, that's not the biggest deal in the world, but just speaking about this national atmosphere, national environment you're in. And again, I don't want to spend too much time on the Buffalo Wild Wings ad, but as you're trying to message about how you are accessible, how you are affordable, it's hard when the Buffalo is rolling his or her eyes. So, Oregon specific. This is the second study I've done for Oregon, did another one a couple years ago. This one we did this summer. We talked to over 1,000 Oregon adults. Happy to answer any nerdy questions. The sample was weighted to the correct demographics of the state in terms of gender, age, race, ethnicity, educational attainment, and region. Also, because there was an election year going on and there was lots of political polling going on, we were able to ask a couple questions for calibration purposes. So for you, we weren't so concerned about whether people were voting for Vice President Harris or President Trump, but we could look at other results in other polls and show the validity of our findings. One thing that we're very interested in, and Carol is very interested in, is just simply how aware are people in the state of the University of Oregon? Anybody who used to do work in politics, either in front of me or below me or behind me, might know this as hard ID, is another way of saying it. So, what proportion of people in Oregon were willing to say something about you? So one way we measure awareness is just we ask a reputation question, and I'll show you the results of that reputation question in a second here, but just subtract from 100 the people who answered the question and the people who wouldn't answer the question. So Oregon State University, University of Oregon have very high awareness levels. That is very typical. It's never uniform, but very typical of what we will see for major state institutions within the state. Oregon Health and Science University, a little bit below, but a fairly high profile in the state. And just so you can sort of put these numbers in context, I like it when the data makes sense, right? That people know the Oregon institutions more than they know these other institutions. UCLA, we put in there, it's a known brand nationally. It's a known brand on the West Coast, and we see that. University of Washington up the road a little bit. And we put Johns Hopkins in there because one thing we have found consistently in our polling, and it speaks to the value that Americans place on medical and health research, is how aware people are of Johns Hopkins. Now, when we ask them where it is, people have no idea. But the way I sort of explain it is Hopkins had a very high profile before COVID. And then with COVID and the COVID tracker, that just that just rocketed up. And one of the ways I explain it is if you were a Hollywood producer making a movie and you needed a heroin doctor, where would that heroin doctor be from? From Hopkins, which just sort of speaks to that brand. But these numbers, just to put it in context for you. And then here are the proportions of people rating the university excellent, good, not so good, poor, I've never heard of it, and I don't know. So there is generally good news here. And Oregon's reputation in the state is at or higher than what I typically see when I do work for other great state institutions in their home state. And again, the Hopkins effect is amazing, right? I'm doing these surveys all over the country. People have no idea where Hopkins is, but it has this national brand. You also see Oregon Health and Science University, which is obviously Health and Science University, the medical school here, also enjoying a very strong reputation in the state. One of the things I think Carol's going to talk about is don't know. And so let me talk about don't know for a second, and let me talk about light blue. So one of my quibbles also with the Pews of the world and the Gallups of the world who tend to ask about higher education is that they don't give a don't know option to people. And you have to give a don't know option. Any students who are thinking about writing surveys here, you got to give a don't know option in a survey for the brilliant social science reason that people don't know. Right? And if you don't allow them to say don't know, they'll make up an answer and you're getting noise. Whereas that don't know is information. And that don't know is particularly valuable information for Carol because don't knows are an opportunity to communicate. An even better opportunity to communicate is those light blues. So if I have the privilege of coming back here in a couple years and talking to you about survey research, and we've done another study, I think one of the things we want to look at is it's really hard to move people who don't like you. It's hard also to move people who don't know anything about you, but let's try and take some of those soft positives and make them more intensely positive. So if I was doing my headline up here, instead of the boring perceived reputation of UO and peers, it would be light blue to dark blue is the opportunity here for the University of Oregon. Here's the trend. And again, this is an approval question. You're going to see a variety of different dependent variables from me or outcome variables from me. One of the challenges of doing work for universities is, listen, I come from a political background and do lots of election polling, which is not so pleasant or easy anymore, but at least you know what's the outcome variable that you're measuring. Is the horse race, is the ballot question. For you, there's a whole variety of different ballot questions. And I was talking to Chris, who I've gotten to know about sort of, other different ballot measures, if you will, in terms of the state. So this is an approval question. This is about where I see it with other great institutions in other states. Perhaps your light blue, the total blue of the total positives about the same. Your light blue is a little bit lower than I'd want it to be. So again, light blue to dark blue. But I like that the trend is up. I like that don't knows are down, and we're doing the exact same methodology. So we have comparable data here. So there hasn't been an increase. There has been an increase since 2022. And again, I'm not just giving you one outcome variable, but a variety of them. And you will get sick of me saying light blue to dark blue, and also 15% don't knows is less than 22. And I'd like to see that trend continue to come down and the movement go to positive. What's also interesting is in those Gallup numbers that I started out with, and you saw the sharp drop over the last 13 years, and that drop continued in 2024. That drop has been among all partisan groups, but has been more pronounced among Republicans. And you hear about people talking about the education gap or the gender gap. There's also a tremendous partisan gap in people's views of higher education. You have one here, but it is much less than I see in other states, and certainly much less than I see in national polling, where this is a gap, not a chasm. And we're seeing a much larger gap in other places.
I was going to ask on the
Sure.
on the 1,000 or so we polled, did you specifically use some geographic diversity?
Yeah, so it's representative of the state as a whole. And so we do a random sample, so it should fall out, but then we look at it afterwards. And if we have to true it up a little bit in terms of region or demographics, we do that. Yeah. This is one of my favorite questions. I shouldn't have favorite slides, but this is one of my favorite. And again, in the spirit of there's multiple dependent variables, there's multiple outcome variables. You can think of a variety of different things about a university. You can be frustrated with a variety of different things about a university. My kid didn't get in. I'm not the offensive coordinator, to just give you, give a couple examples, right? Different things. There's too much construction. I can't, all sorts of stuff. But like at the end of the day, you can be frustrated with an institution, but, and I'm paraphrasing the question here, obviously, it's like, come on, don't you think at the end of the day, the state of Oregon is better off because of University of Oregon? And that's a great number. So I do this all over the place. 73 to 15 is at the very high end of what I see. Less than 50.
Can I ask you a question about
Sure,
that?
absolutely.
Do you find in states where there is more higher ed presence, like I think of like Illinois or Florida or Texas or California, where there's a lot more market, if you will, I guess, for higher education institutions, do you see then more competition, if you will? Because in Oregon, we don't have a university on every corner.
Yeah, it's a good question. So sometimes I'm doing work in a state, like a Wisconsin, right, where there's one major research institution in the state. Then I'm doing work in a California where there's 9 or 10 AAU institutions in the state. So typically you would see a university do better when there is less, not necessarily the number of other universities, but less major well-known universities as competition. I think your state is, there's one AAU institution in this state, and you're that institution, but there's another very large, prominent, popular institution in the state. And there is, I watch a little football, right? There's competition on and off the field. But that said, given that, most of the people, it's not like the people who like Oregon State University don't like you. The people who think the state is worse off because of these institutions are more likely to just be grouchy about higher education in general. And here's the trend in the value to the state. Not a hugely statistically significant, but I will say the brilliant thing, I would rather see it go up than down, right? Yes.
The positive feelings about entire state funding levels?
So, yes. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, listen, at the end of the day, and I'm not speaking about, you at all. But I think many AAU institutions had to get used to exercising their political muscles and storytelling muscles, that it just wasn't going to be automatic. And what we see is places that move that, move that number. Now, listen, there's so many factors influencing that, but when you talk to the folks who are talking with elected leaders, they don't always win their arguments, but working in an environment where people appreciate the university, even if they don't go there, even if they don't root for your football team, can still say, yep, at the end of the day, I think this state is better off because we have this great research institution.
Excuse me. I had
Yes.
a question, sort of following up on Tim's question. Should we assume that the largest proportion of these respondents were along the I-5 corridor? So Portland, Salem, Eugene?
No, it's a representative sample of the state.
But that would mean they would be along
Huh?
Yeah, so it's whatever the population, it's a representative
populous.
sample of the state.
Okay.
So
All right. I just be interesting to know what, if Portland State had been included in what.
so again, all parts of the state
Right.
have been included. I don't think we have it in this deck, but we do have regional breakdowns, which we did by media market and also congressional district.
And Ken, what was the date in 2024 that you did the poll?
It was mid-August. So, again, another dependent variable, another outcome variable. This is something that this is on the average end, or perhaps even the lower end of what we sometimes see. And you see lots of questions now about whether a college education is valuable, is worth it. Exactly. And we're seeing some differences also in big gender gap on this question as well, and especially among younger men. Often you'll see the question asked as a two punch or a two answer. Is a college degree valuable or not valuable? We like asking it as a three punch with the don't know as well. So is it not valuable at all? Valuable and worth the cost? Valuable and not worth the cost? And so what we typically see in our work is that relatively few Americans, relatively few people in individual state, national Americans, and then relatively few in individual states when we do the work, think a degree is not valuable at all. That 6% is actually on the lower end of not valuable at all. But where we see often pluralities or very close is valuable but not worth the cost. And that's a really important thing to track, because what it's saying is people realize a college degree in general, a college degree from a great university like yours is valuable, but they don't perceive it as accessible or affordable to them. And that is, we talk about so much, we make things so complicated. That is the biggest vulnerability to our universities in general. There's a national study. So college degree from one of America's leading research universities. Now, particular universities in particular places will typically do better, but you see here that the plurality answer, 46 of Americans saying a college degree is valuable but not worth the cost.
If you went, how many years would you have to go back, or could you go back when the light blue was below 30 or 25?
You know, it's a great question. I started at AAU in 2017, and they hadn't really been doing this sort of work before. My impressionistic sense from other questions, and also sort of correlating it with some of that that Gallup, that it probably turned about 10 years ago, but then the the next derivative, right? The speed of that change is accelerating. So, this is one of those questions. Again, we're trying to sort of mimic that. Would you recommend Delta Airlines, Hertz Rent-A-Car, Hilton? And I'm looking at Marcia. She might not be recommending Delta Airlines, particularly at this second after her experience yesterday. I ran into her in the lobby. And again, I'm going to give you the brilliant analysis of I'd rather see this number higher than lower. But whether or not I would recommend someone to go to the University of Oregon, it's a little bit about the kid. It's a little bit about you. But these are some, comparative numbers here for you. Now, all of my data so far is as good or better than I typically see. This is lower than I typically see. That a fairly low proportion of a representative sample of people in the state believe that you are one of America's leading research universities. Okay? And you see a little bit below Oregon State, again, Hopkins up there, a name brand, medicine, Stanford, well-known, UCLA a bit higher. But for a great institution like this in a state, that is a number that I would like to see higher. And let me be clear, not just because I'm the research nerd coming from AAU, but it is important for the American people to understand. It's important for people in this state to understand you're doing incredible things, and we're going to talk about that more, about how you're perceived there, of educating students, but also to understand what the other very direct, tangible benefits of a research enterprise at a great state institution is. Again, for the people who aren't gonna send their kids to your university and may not even root for your football team.
Got it.
In fact, they might even root against your football team.
So is this a choose one or check all that apply?
This is a check all that apply.
And this is the best kept secret.
This is the best kept secret. Yep.
But these are the
research.
same respondents that said they would not recommend, they recommend Oregon over Stanford.
Yeah. So again, it's, are they also recommending because they think Stanford, they see Stanford's $100,000. They don't think their kid they're recommending could get in. So again, there's a variety of reasons why that would be the case. In some ways, you brought me out here. We did this big survey research project, and this is the Captain Obvious finding. But I sometimes have to, not Carl and Chris, but remind other university leaders about this. And so, permission to be slightly sarcastic, right? It turns out that parents would like their kids to get jobs and for their education to be affordable. Shocking, right? We, the global we, don't talk about that enough. Again, I want it to be accessible, affordable, and I love my kid, but I'd like them out of the basement when they graduate and get a job. And unambiguously, we see this in national data, and unambiguously, we see that here with what people say they want colleges and universities in this state to prioritize.
I think there's a correlation. Recognize that if they get the job, it is more affordable, or is that totally two different questions?
It's a great question, and we're going to talk more about this, but let me give you one thought on it. When I first started doing this, presidents and chancellors would get really frustrated and say things like, but it only costs X thousand dollars. Like to a normal person, now the fact of the matter is like 0 is the correct number that many people want to pay. So it's really difficult to say you're not expensive, okay? Even if there's a lot of variance here, right? And if you look at tuitions, you are on the lower end, just, you're an in-state kid here of what you would pay to go to one of America's leading research universities. So we have to talk about value. We have to talk about the other side of the equation. And that is crucial to doing this, because I think sort of, pounding on just the cost side. And I don't know if you circulated, but there was an article in the New York Times a day or two ago about, free college and how universities are communicating. You can make that commitment to some segment. You can't make that commitment to everybody. So for everybody else, it's going to have to be a strong value argument. Carol added in the arrows for me here, so we like them. But again, like being affordable, getting kids jobs. Listen, athletics is great. Athletics is this incredible platform for you. People probably aren't telling the truth. They probably find that a little bit more important. But at the end of the day, they also get what is core to the university. Now, how you doing? Okay. And this is before this fall, right? So so I bet you moved a lot of light blue to dark blue on having a top sports programs, but then you see, preparing students for future careers, providing students with world-class education are second and third, but like exactly the excellent is less than half. So again, have to do light blue to dark blue. And that's a combination of talking about it, but then the hard work of, doing it as well, which is a combination of politics and philanthropy, I think.
Can I, sorry, Marcia. Can I pause, just go back this slide, Ken? And I just want to really dwell for a moment or call everyone's attention to the slide prior to that, being affordable for students as possible. 80% of people say that that's a top priority, and fewer than 9% say we do an excellent job on being as affordable as possible. That is an amazing disconnect, I'll assert, from reality. So we spend I think in the order of $80 million a year on financial aid. And so with Oregon Promise and other programs, we're effectively close to free for most low and moderate income children, or most low and moderate income students from Oregon families. And there's an amazing disconnect between that. And that, there's lots of fascinating results here, but that one is in some ways my most frustrating, and yeah, hard to reconcile. And I think maybe one of the most important.
So unambiguously the most important. So then do one of those fancy
Carl, do we have like I think about like catchy, like, are we actually telling people that? It's one thing to do it, but if we don't tell anybody, like, screaming into the wind.
I agree. And the moment we try to tell people there's the word Pell Grant in there, and eyes are just going to glaze over. And so, one of the things we've talked about, I don't know if we can achieve it, to be honest, but something, informally in-house we'll call, this is a public. We're thinking a lot about this.
Ken, is there?
Notice how we're controlling what Carl says. We didn't even give him his own mic.
I'm going to keep it over here.
in that New York Times article, this isn't on, so in that New York Times article, which I really recommend that people go read, there's a great quote that says, that part of this is actually about the dollars and cents, and part of it is about the communication of what you are doing. I think it's both and. So.
Is there any between this slide and the last slide, the prior slide? Is this consistent among other universities, or is there any standard deviation between what we have and?
We didn't cut and paste the slide. We could have cut and pasted the slide. It is very, very similar. Not dependent on the facts of the case for a particular university. And again, sort of back to my Buffalo Wild Wings example, that's just a huge headwind. And also, listen, there are many, many benefits of you being considered one of America's leading research universities and mentioned in the same sentence as these other great universities. Some of those private ones are about to announce that their tuition's over $100,000, right? And so, we could do this on another survey. I wonder what the results would be if we asked the people of Oregon exactly what tuition is. I bet it would be high.
What was those that did not think it was affordable? What was the social and economic background of that respondent?
So people of a lower socioeconomic background are less likely to think the university is affordable, but there's so little variance in that number that there's not much variance in the crosstab. It's almost across every single educational level and income level. People think it's not affordable. And we also deal, again, speaking generally, I do not know how it works here, but in many institutions there is a pretty significant middle class donut hole where families not making a nice living, but that's the sort of living where they can write an after-tax check of X thousand dollars for a college education.
Yeah, I was curious, do you think that there's kind of some crossover thinking from people answering this about preparing students for future careers with the backdrop of a debt load in terms of being able to earn their way out of their situation? So they're kind of coloring their answer. I mean, you could say it's just pure career, but then you've got this load of, 125,000 in debt, and you're a teacher.
Yeah. So coverage of debt is also sort of unvaried. And I mean, we'll do this at different universities, and I don't know what the average debt that a University of Oregon student graduates with. It's not $125,000 at the undergraduate level. It's
20, 23, 20, 25. And that's conditional on having debt. Like half of our students graduate with $0 of debt. And if you have debt, the mean amount is, I think, 23, 24,000.
I was like, people don't believe that.
Yeah, they don't believe it.
They don't,
Yeah,
people
they don't believe
don't believe it.
And maybe in a future poll, you could ask what people think it is and what they think it should be.
Yeah.
Maybe you have that data already.
We have some of that at the national level. I'll share with you. Yeah.
So I think I hear you saying that higher education, especially maybe when we talk about leading research universities, regardless of public or private, kind of are getting lumped into a group, and there are perceptions about costs. And so the amount of lift it's going to take to break through that is probably significant.
Yes.
Well,
But to Carl, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
Go
but
ahead.
I think too, isn't it kind of married in this political distrust of institutions where you saw that every one of those on your ranking has gone down since 2015 in terms of confidence, right?
So so the headwind you are facing is not only universities, but it's institutions in this country, and it's the people who deliver messages, right? So, the old style is, well, let's get the mainstream media to do some stories about how it's actually affordable, and people go, yeah, don't believe that, which really is a challenge. Listen, it's difficult, it's hard, but to Carl's point, and again, we didn't sort of do that management consultant strategic map thing here, right? But you can picture it is like, the thing that people think is the most important, we're really being challenged on. But you have no choice to try and move that number. Now, I'm not coming here saying, Carol, when I come back next year, I need to see that at 80 from 9, because she's good. She's not that good, right? But we have no choice but to try and move that. And I think sometimes, and again, it's not you, sometimes people, and it's always, difficult politics. And just think about how this works in your personal life when you try and tell someone that something's not a problem, right? Or it's not important. This is the environment we're in, and that's what people think is important, and we got to move those numbers. There's a number I think I'd like to see a little bit higher. And again, what is this, my 6, 7 different dependent variable, and generally pretty good. But you sometimes see a disconnect between people. Yes, I think the state's better off, but I don't actually understand, if I don't go there, if I don't send my kid there, if I live a couple hours away, why the university being in the state not only sort of generically has an impact on the state, but makes a difference for me and my family. Your ratings for the university here, you see that? And that big, so you've seen that slide before. And don't know is, Carol's being very calm here, but Carol gets very excited when she sees don't know. She's usually pretty mellow, but right, don't know is a communication opportunity, and light blue is a communication opportunity. I'll just quickly go through this and then give it to Carol here. Generally positive across many of the measures, even better than I often see, not as partisan as I often see. That's the excellence and the goods. Like I said, want to see the light blues, the dark blue. Where we have trend, we don't see huge changes, but the direction is in a positive direction. This recommend, again, not so sure what to make of this. Would rather see the number higher than lower, and something that will also track along with a variety of other different. I will turn it over to Carol here. Oh. Okay, you want me to do this? Okay. So I've said it a couple different times. If I came here and all the numbers were on the extremes, have a nice conversation, would have a cocktail with you afterwards, and I would say, there's not really much to do. But you have a combination of general, I'll use the word favorability, generally strong affect, with some serious weaknesses and some serious misunderstandings of what's going on. That's opportunity. It's not easy, but it's opportunity. And to Carl's point of making the connection between what's most important and how you're doing is the most crucial thing.
Just worried that I'm going to ask questions that Carol's going to answer. Maybe I should just wait.
Tell you if I'm going to answer it or not.
Well, I'm mindful of, if we only had students from the University of Oregon, from the state of Oregon, we would not be able to pay you for doing any work. So for me, these questions need to be asked on a national and frankly, an international basis. And
So we'll get to some of that,
Okay, good,
actually, yes. Yeah, we'll touch on it. I think there's more there to talk about. Okay. Anything else for Ken? Okay. He's staying after the show, so you can ask. Okay. So I'm going to talk about a little bit of what we do about these opportunities. And I think, sort of by way of summary, while reputation, what he just said, and approval of the U of O is strong in the state, we are less well-known than we should be, regionally and nationally, for the quality of education, the research that we deliver. So the question really is, how do we best address this? Like, this fantastic data, shame on us if we do nothing with it, then, study the problem. So we're going to start moving against this. But the question is, how do we best address this? It's really tempting to say, well, we just need to do a better job telling our story. And while that's not wrong, it's not nearly as simple as that. So if we want to tell our story in a way that provides measurable business value against the objectives and the aspirations laid out in, let's say, Oregon Rising, we need to understand how that actually works, a little bit of human psychology here. So I'm going to be a little Ross Perot with the charts and graphs here and just walk through very briefly, like, what does that look like? So awareness. I know, right? Then what? What is that? Hopefully 2 of you got that, that reference. Yeah, exactly. We'll talk to me. And thanks for the visual on that. That makes me love that. I love that. Thank you. All right. So awareness. Are people aware of the organization, reputation? What's the general, again, you're talking about general reputation, general perceptions of the organization. Then we talked about preference. The next thing on this model is preference. To what extent is the organization or product, you can insert the word product there too, preferred over other options in the market? That's based largely not just on general reputation, but specific beliefs and associations. This is a model that's generic, it's not specific to the U of O. Okay. And then we have affinity, which is willingness to identify with the organization, like, wear a shirt that has the thing, or followership in social media. And then we have purchase decisions. Will people purchase, promote, or financially give to the organization? And then, of course, we have ongoing emotional relationship with the organization, right? That's your basic model. The model is not static, so it shifts all the time with people's real experiences and in the real world with the brand, and also with changes in reputation. Big reputational hits will affect this model. Likewise, big brand moments will affect this model. It's fluid. It's never static. Organizations can choose to participate in this model, or they can choose to be passive. But this is always functioning all the time. So I'm going to just briefly touch on each of these within the context of what Ken has just presented. So let's talk about awareness briefly. U of O enjoys national and really international visibility, and it has an outsized profile for its size. It really does. The Big Ten, of course, has provided an even larger national stage. And I think the connections that we have through our own story to iconic American brands like Nike and Disney really provide a lift into popular culture that almost no other university enjoys. And again, the slide that we just saw on awareness, just among Oregonians. Let's talk about reputation. It's positive, but general. And what are some of the drivers of that sort of general positive reputation? Well, we are an accessible, comprehensive research university, an R01 institution, a member of AAU. We are in the top 3 to 4% of all four-year universities. There are 2,828 of them in this country, as measured by US News, Princeton Review, and others. UO is seen by Oregonians as an asset to the state. We have a lovely and diverse and rich scope of academic offerings, from professional schools to the arts to everything in between. So we're not Oberlin or MIT. We're really beautifully diversified across our offerings. And we saw in the survey, although it wasn't in the deck, you saw strong positive associations from those who'd attended or knew someone who had attended. Almost all of it was knew someone. I know someone's niece went there and she had a positive association. Actually, we actually took out alumni, so that's actually not correct. I'm going to skip over, and again, you saw the perceived reputation that Ken just provided. Again, the excellent and good combined here is 86%. Those are strong, but again, general perceptions of reputation. I'm going to skip preference on purpose here and go to affinity. The Ducks 2 years ago, which was the most recent data I could find, have the 7th largest fan base in the country. That means for every alumna or alumnus, there are 18 to 22 people who never set foot in any of our classrooms or on campuses, who follow, purchase tickets, purchase merchandise, support the Ducks, and walk through airports saying "Go Ducks." That's an enormous ratio. The only other university that comes close in terms of its like alumni to fan base ratio is Notre Dame, and I can tell you this year we've definitely surpassed Notre Dame in this one. So really, we're standing head and shoulders, sort of in a different space than almost any other university, maybe any other university. The tangible and intangible value of this affinity is in the many millions of dollars. It's a significant and strategic asset for this university. And brands spend decades and millions of dollars to get the kind of soft equity that we see that we're standing on today. And I don't want us to underestimate that. It also represents a really important opportunity to expand what people think of when they think of the U of O, right? We need to use that platform to widen the aperture, if you will, to help answer that question. What's the first thing you think of with more things than they're currently answering that? So let's talk about preference. So preference, again, is the degree to which people will prefer, in this case, the U of O to other options in the market based on, and this is really based on specific associations, not just general reputation. So if you think about buying a car and you have a large investment, you might have general associations about Mercedes or Volvo or Saab or whatever, or Ford. But when you go to purchase that car, you're really evaluating on the specifics. And so, as you just saw, many survey respondents indicated that they didn't feel they had enough information to answer questions about the U of O's specific strengths in many areas. All those grays, right? Those I don't knows that I get so excited about because like that's an open door to help start a conversation with them. We didn't show this also because of time constraints, but we did ask the question, what is the first thing that you think of when you think of the University of Oregon? Those top of mind associations reflect the fact that most of what people have heard or seen about the U of O has been related to our amazing athletic program. It's also a function of the fact that we have really engaged in no formal public facing communications, advertising, or public relations. So by default, of course, what they're seeing is disproportionately, but also amazingly, are the performance of our Ducks on the field. So this is that I don't know that I get excited about, which is again, the open door to start having a conversation. Much, much, much easier to fill in a blank than it is to dissuade people from an opinion they already have. So while this is like, we would like to see all of this filled in with light blue or dark blue, this is actually not bad. It's not green, right? It's not, I think this is terrible. So that this means that we have, with the exception perhaps of affordability, where it's a little bit more work to do, we have really an opening to walk in and help them fill that in. So this is a graph that shows the answers to that top of mind associations. What's the first thing that you think of? 72% of respondents, again, this is within Oregon, cited Ducks football or athletic programs. 18%, 1 in 5, cited academics, and those who did cited quality of academic programs, someone they knew whose person had gone there, and research. And a lot of point of pride for the state, which was an interesting sort of qualitative subtext to a lot of the comments as well on this question. So I think the opportunity we're looking at is how do we increase the 18% to something larger? And how we're going to do that. So I want to quote friend of the university and Duck, Corey DeBrow, about how complicated this is. In a fragmented media landscape with consumers of information facing an unprecedented volume of noise and clutter, brands and organizations need to reach their most important audiences, not only via the right platform at the right time, but also through a range of messages and experiences that earn their attention and inspire action. We are not speaking to one audience, we're speaking to many. We'll need to be sophisticated in how we direct the right message at the right time through the right medium to the right audience. So just stolen my next slide here. So our one approach will not suffice, right? We need to expand perception, and we need to answer that sort of fill in the what do you think of when you think of the U of O. But we need to do so very deliberately in ways that support the aspirations and priorities in Oregon Rising, which when we talk about accessibility, graduation rates, career preparedness, 2 out of 4 of the goals outlined in that plan directly address those. We need to elevate at reputation, but we need to do that. Everything needs to work for everything. So if we're successful at elevating reputation, it will make the job of recruiting students here easier. It will make the job of preparing for a capital campaign easier. It will essentially soften the beachhead for every other thing that we want to accomplish. And then I think to Ken's point earlier, we can't ignore what people feel is important as much as we want to just tell our story. It needs to be bi-directional, and we need to be responsive to the market like any other organization that the consumer brands are too. We need to speak to the priorities that Oregonians and frankly Americans feel are important. Affordability and accessibility is top, but also quality, career preparedness, and yes, economic benefit and scientific research, which were in there and had very positive associations. But until we really address the top three, we probably won't see a lot of traction with the general population on things like scientific research. We'll need to hit that in the context of also addressing accessibility and quality. That doesn't prevent us from talking in specific ways to peers and to media, however, about research. So I'm going to touch about that in a second. So I've got sort of 4 things to touch on here before we can take questions about how we're approaching this opportunity. One is that we will do all of this by really embracing our distinctly Oregon DNA. Higher education is really having a moment, right? A moment of great difficulty right now. We have the tremendous benefit of being an iconic institution that sits both in higher education and in the popular culture. We will differentiate the university by leaning into what people already believe about us. Largely, these are the qualities of innovation, entrepreneurship, bold thinking, style, and speed. And while some people might primarily associate that with our performance in the field, that's a feature, not a bug of the university. We look at our history, we look at our leaders, we look at our past presidents, we look at our alumni, we look at our faculty. We have a long, proud, and consistent history of innovation, challenger thinking, outsider thinking, speed of innovation and thought. This is the same thing that we're seeing on the field. It's a product of the university, not, again, a feature, not a bug. And there is a reason that the great organization that is Nike was created, saw its origin certainly at the University of Oregon. We share that DNA.
Carol, what's your expectation of those 10 pictures the average person around this table can identify?
One of them is not Ross Perot. One of them is not Ross Perot. So we have 2. Yeah. So do you want me to name them? As the newbie here, please don't do that to me. I mean, we certainly have.
Steve can do 8.
Yeah, I can probably do 7.
Someone
6.
does all 10?
All 10. I think I might be able to do all 10.
Can we name them quickly? just
Sure.
to pay homage.
Right, left, right.
Sure.
Top to bottom.
Steve Prefontaine.
Dave Barman.
Carol Meyer.
Homage.
Barman. Carolyn Chambers. Yep. Mabel, I blanking on her last name. I will find her full name. That's I should know that by heart. She's first African American female graduate, and she went on to do some really amazing things. Yeah. Ann Curry.
Ann Curry, I didn't know the next.
John Paul Jones is next to Ann Curry.
John who?
John Paul Jones was
investor?
No, actually, no, an architect. Thank you. Architect and Native American architect and thought leader.
Cool.
Mm-hmm.
Riviere.
And Kesey.
I like this.
Phil Knight.
The guy that looks like Phil Knight, but isn't
Yeah.
it? It is a younger Phil Knight. I never knew him at that age.
Yeah.
I think you would like.
I mean, there's all kind, we could put, there's a lot more people we can put on this slide. I think this was really a demonstration project of, again, feature, not a bug. This is something that is in our DNA, and it's something that people believe about us. Not just us saying this about us, but increasingly others recently, Poets and Quants, which those of you who've liked, it's an important rating blog and resource for people looking at MBA programs, just ranked as number 6 in the nation for top entrepreneur programs for MBAs. And Princeton Review just ranked us as number 23 for undergraduate entrepreneurship programs. That's a jump of 27 positions from last year. Tremendous jump up. You're also seeing it in look at the goal 4 areas, look at the things that we're doing that are truly new models, right? So looking at GSUN and the human performance in sport, not just to do better on the field, but to really change the world through the sport.
We just
Seems to have gone off again. Thank you. And certainly with Balmer, we're going to hear more about this evening, and you all know well, is this not working either? Is this working? Okay, cool. So just, really creating a new model, not waiting to for others to address the critical workforce shortage for children's mental and behavioral health workers and in the midst of an epidemic of child mental health, by creating a new credential and a whole new model that can be scalable.
I'm sorry,
No.
Carol. I was just, I mean, I hear you totally, but have we actually, we tested that this is brand perceptions?
Some of that is coming through the qualitative research, and we are about to, in January, we will be doing more work to tease that and to message test that with some key audiences. Yeah, we will.
On the Princeton numbers,
Mhm.
it went up 28 points in 1 year. Who gets to take credit for that?
Carl?
So smooth.
We're getting blamed for everything else.
I'll give you that one, but what did I mean, it's many, but Jeff Sorensen has been leading our efforts. He sort of drives entrepreneurship program. He's associated with Lundquist, but he's great about playing well with others across campus. So if you haven't had a chance to meet Jeff Sorensen, he's doing fantastic work. But it's Carol, it's the communications team.
But doesn't
Bob,
Jeff Sorensen,
Bob Goldberg, sorry.
Well, I was just saying, didn't Jeff Sorensen start some entrepreneur conference or something, and has attracted people from all over the country, and that really raised the profile?